humans are very smart. We're sort of the superintelligence of the natural world, like certainly compared to plants or bacteria or whatever. This has resulted in a pretty amazing transformation of the planet. We're moving into potentially a world where we're no longer the smartest thing. When you have something that is significantly smarter than humans, it may start to reshape the environment towards its goals. And as a result, it has the potential to drive humans to extinction. We're going to build this powerful machine, and then we'll use the powerful machine to align it, right? That's like very scary. I would much rather we not build it, slow down, take a breath. This is extremely dangerous, and anybody who's pursuing this project should be aware that they are threatening every child, man, woman, animal, and I don't recommend it. But I'm but maybe. There's also this sense of hope in me. AI is not a normal technology. The standard story is that we try to make an airplane, right? Maybe it takes off, but then crashes shortly thereafter, and you go back to the drawing board and you say, okay, what happened? With AI, especially with building a super intelligent machine that has the potential to wipe everyone out, if you do make a mistake, it could be catastrophic. But once it's killed everyone, there's no ability to go back to the drawing board.
Max Harms is an alignment researcher at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, where since 2017 he has worked on the problem of aligning an artificial intelligence and keeping it steerable. His main research agenda is corrigibility, an approach that prioritizes making AIs, robustly rule-following or instruction-following and willingly modifiable to the exclusion, basically, of all other goals. He's also a science fiction author, having written the Crystal Society trilogy and the recently released Red Heart, which imagines an AGI being developed in a secret Chinese government project. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Max.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here.
So a different book came out recently in September of this year. It's called If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, Why Superhuman AI Would Kill Us All. I guess probably viewers can guess what the argument being made in the book is, even if they haven't heard of it already. It's not written by you, but it's written by your longtime colleagues at MIRI, Eliezer Yudkowsky and Nate Soares. I guess Eliezer is the famous progenitor, the modern progenitor, I guess, of the idea that artificial superintelligence would be incredibly hard to keep steerable or aligned with human goals. And I guess it's not exactly your views, but
it's pretty close. I think that there's a little bit of difference in perspective, but I definitely agree with the thesis. And
yeah. Interestingly, I guess it's been a reasonably polarizing book, but I would say quite well received in the broader public, maybe more so than among sorts of experts who work in the area, who I guess perhaps are more focused on the technical details than the broader argument.
Yeah. There's obviously in any sort of field, there's the different camps and different people have different perspectives. But I think it's been quite successful. It was a New York Times bestseller, and the ordinary people who have read the book that are in my life seem to be receptive to the arguments.
Yeah. So later on, I guess we're going to debate some of the arguments that are put forth in the book that I guess haven't fully persuaded me as yet. But incredibly, I guess, despite talking about AI risk on this show since 2017, we've never had a forthright presentation of the Eliezer or MIRI perspective on the whole issue. So that's where we should start. What is the argument that Eliezer and Nate are making in a nutshell?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I think they're saying that if we build, or basically if anyone in the world builds an artificial superintelligence in the near future, that will cause an existential catastrophe, like everyone dying. And one of the things I like about the book is that I think the arguments for this are pretty streamlined. It's a pretty short book. It's pretty accessible. So let's start with intelligence. It's artificial superintelligence. And I think taking intelligence seriously is pretty important. Compared to, say, lions or wolves or whales or whatever, humans are very smart, right? We're definitely the most intelligent creatures on the planet. We're sort of the superintelligence of the natural world, certainly compared to plants or bacteria or whatever. And I think there's a way in which this human superintelligence has resulted in a pretty amazing transformation of the planet, right? We're the only species that has ever gone to the moon. And, we've spread across all the continents and have transformed the natural world. And in the process of doing that, have driven many species to extinction. We've destroyed environments and just generally reshaped the world and the natural environment to our ends, right? Developing technology and everything else. And I think like one of the most basic frames on the book's argument is that we're moving into potentially a world where we're no longer the smartest thing, right? If we build an artificial superintelligence that is superintelligent relative to humans, that this status as the most intelligent being on the planet will change, and that when you have something that is significantly smarter than humans, it may start to reshape the environment in a similar sort of way towards its goals. And as a result, it has the potential to drive humans to extinction or reshape us towards whatever it cares about. Like as part of this, we understand intelligence as a kind of steering, a kind of shaping the world towards some goal or some ends. And so like we talk about like machines, the book talks about machines having goals and how that makes sense. Like AI researchers tend to sort of use a bunch of different terms synonymously: goals, values, preferences, drives. It all sort of means the same thing. It's like when you are intelligently taking actions, what are you steering towards? And so I think that understanding that machines can have goals, and then is a part of that, and then understanding that those goals might be in alignment or not in alignment with humanity. So if those are the same goals as ours, then it might be fine to have a super intelligent machine taking lots of actions in the world. But if those goals come out of sync with ours and the machine is misaligned, even slightly misaligned, this could be very, very bad. And importantly, I think one of the core points of the book is that we as a species don't know how to align AIs. That like we know how to build machines that are increasingly powerful, but we don't know how to guarantee that those things are steering the world towards good futures. We might fear that like we could build a very powerful AI, but then it would steer the world into a bad state.
Yeah, so I think that there's a common sense version of this entire argument that if you're going to build a being, a creature that is much more capable than you, can like think much faster, it's just much more across, it can do science much faster than you, it can come up with plans and scheme much better than you.
Right.
You better be careful that you better be careful about doing that, because if it has it in for you, or if it has like very different goals, then you could lose control, and that the superintelligence could end up being the dominant party here. I think for just ordinary people who hear that there are companies trying to build basically artificial superintelligence, beings that are just vastly more capable than perhaps even humanity collectively without AI, that sounds incredibly unnerving, I think, for just these like extremely common sense reasons. And that might be one reason why the argument in the book, in many ways, has just resonated with people who've never really thought about this before, who are kind of finding out that artificial superintelligence is the goal for the first time.
In many ways, I think it's just a very common sense position. And I think there are things that aren't as like obvious, but in a lot of ways, I think this is like where people should start. And then there's like an additional, like the burden of proof is sort of on, yes, this thing that we're doing that sort of, if you read about it in a story seems sort of obviously dangerous, is in fact safe, right? Like the burden of proof is on demonstrating safety as opposed to danger.
Yeah. So I think that helps to explain why, I guess, the super majorities of the public, when asked in opinion polling, I think favor bans on attempts to develop ASI. But I guess Eliezer and Nate, they go further than just presenting that basic argument for why we should be nervous about the entire thing. There's many other, I guess, specific ideas that help to build a more concrete vision of how they expect that things would play out. Sure. What are some of those other aspects that help to add, flesh on the bones here?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of detail, right, that hang off of this common sense argument. One point is that AI is not a normal technology. Like when we are considering how technological development tends to go, I think the standard story is that we, take a crack at it. Scientists and engineers like develop, try to make an airplane, right? And then they do their best, and it maybe takes off, but then crashes shortly thereafter. And you go back to the drawing board and you say, okay, like what happened? How can we fix that? And then you iterate and make more mistakes and iterate and so on and so forth. And this, you eventually figure out how to do it. With AI, especially with building a super intelligent machine that has the potential to wipe everyone out, if you do make a mistake, it could be catastrophic. And, there's only... once it's killed everyone, there's no ability to go back to the drawing board. So I think that illustrating this is like one of the points. There's also like specific details of ways in which AIs have already demonstrated misalignment or gone off the rails. And then, like a bunch of like talking about specifics, like, wait, like, is the machine actually going to be dangerous? Couldn't we just unplug it? Like, it's stuck in a computer, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different places where a person might have a hang up or whatever. But I think the core argument is very small in a sense.
So I guess the things that stand out to me, there's the orthogonality thesis, that basically any arbitrarily capable or I guess intelligent being could have any goal that it's trying to aim towards. That in principle, just because you're very capable at accomplishing goals doesn't mean that you have a sensible goal by our lights.
Like I think the orthogonality thesis is best seen by its contrast, where I think some people have this intuition that intelligent beings naturally become more moral or have like some set of values that they like come to understand as they get more intelligent. And orthogonality is basically just the idea that that's not true, that you could have something that's extremely smart that doesn't necessarily care about whatever.
Yeah, why do you think actually some people have the intuition that capability and common sense morality by our standards are so linked?
Yeah, I think there are multiple reasons. I think it's a pretty natural thing. If your experience of the world is that the smart people around you are the most good, and perhaps you have an experience of growing up and being like not very smart or not very knowledgeable, and then sort of thinking about, the different cultures or different perspectives, expanding your circle of concern sort of as part of that growing up process. You might think, oh, well, when I was young, I didn't care about people on the other side of the world, and maybe the AI won't care about humans when it's young as well, but then as it develops and becomes more intelligent and more knowledgeable, it will start caring about humans. Unfortunately, I think that this is basically humans learn what they care about, and the AI won't be a human, so there's not exactly going to be the same sort of thing that could happen.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about what, I guess, experimental results have we gotten that bear on this in the recent era of AI. I don't know whether you would get people who really disagree with this, or at least in a strong version these days, because I think it's just clear that through reinforcement learning, you could train an AI to be obsessed with accomplishing virtually any goal that you gave it if you reinforced that enough. Yeah,
I experience a lot of people pushing back on orthogonality in a weird way, where they almost just start by saying, oh yeah, obviously orthogonality thesis is true, it's just not relevant. Like, we're building these machines, and so we're going to build them in a way that they care about the things that we care about. But it's like, the orthogonality thesis is mainly pushing against the people who think just training it to be smart will be sufficient, which used to be a big thing. I now think that orthogonality is more or less in the water supply. It's a thing that most people agree with.
Yeah. I guess another part that looms large in the picture is instrumental convergence, or instrumentally convergent goals. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So there's a basic observation that, like, whatever you happen to care about, there are certain things that are useful. So if you really want to grow a bunch of coffee beans, maybe you want money. If you want to be famous, maybe you want money. If you want to end factory farming, maybe you want money, right? Money is an instrumentally convergent thing in that that resource is useful for accomplishing your goals, sort of regardless of what your goals are. Other things that are instrumentally convergent include self-preservation, the accumulation of knowledge, the preservation of your current values, so preventing value drift. A bunch of things, basically just resource accumulation is one frame on it, but yeah.
So yeah, for almost any goal that you want to accomplish, it's good to not be killed. It's good to, I guess, not lose your interest in that goal.
Yep.
It's good to potentially have power and money that you can put towards accomplishing that goal.
Exactly.
Do people question that so much anymore? I think we've again just seen kind of experimental results where you see this starting to happen, and I think it was one of the firmer predictions.
I think this one is just shaken out to be straightforwardly true. I don't know anybody who really doubts it. Actually, I think Jan LeCun is like, oh, I don't think these AIs are going to self-preserve because they're not evolved, and like evolved creatures learned to be self-preserving, but they're not going to have a self-preservation instinct. So I guess I do know of at least one researcher who,
Yeah, I think the problem with that is that there's more than one way to learn a self-preservation instinct.
Yeah,
It might be that humans developed it that way through evolution, but you can get there by thinking about it.
I feel like he's not even engaging with instrumental convergence. He's just like making a mistake about equivocating between terminal values and instrumental values. Like humans, I think, value staying alive terminally. It's like an ends in itself to be alive if you're a human being. Whereas the instrumental convergence, it's like a means to an end. Like you have the AI that's like trying to do whatever it's trying to do, and then it wants to stay alive so that it can do that. So it's slightly different, but both are going to be self-preserving.
Okay, so that is instrumental convergence. I guess another part of the picture that isn't, I guess, a primary focus in the book, but I think is quite an important part of the mental picture that people at MIRI have is the idea that you'll get a very fast recursive self-improvement loop where the AI will become better at doing AI R&D, and that will basically set off a positive reinforcement loop where it's getting smarter, it's getting better at improving itself, and so you get not sort of declining returns in how smart the models are, but really you get like a period of vertiginous improvements in capabilities.
Yeah, this has definitely been a talking point for a long time. I don't know. It's a little bit tricky to go back and like ask what was central, but from my perspective, this has never been a load-bearing part of the MIRI story. Even going back to the days before deep learning was the dominant paradigm, I think the argument has always been something like, when you get superintelligence, that's very dangerous, and one way you might get superintelligence is through a recursive self-improvement that happens very fast. Like you go back and read Eliezer's old papers, and he's like, it could happen in hours or it could happen in years. And so I think that the recursive self-improvement story is more like why might you need to be very concerned ahead of time instead of responding to it when it shows up? And the answer is, well, it might show up in a way that doesn't give you much time to respond.
Okay, yeah, I think we'll come back to that one later, because
Sure.
I think that's been one of the more, I guess, topics of debate among insiders since the book came out. Another part of the picture in my mind is that Eliezer and Nate and people at MIRI in general think that it's relatively straightforward for a superintelligence to not just overpower, some people, but to potentially overpower all of humanity and end up dominant globally and impossible to get rid of. Why do you think that?
Well, okay, so I really don't. So superintelligence is a good term in that it like introduces this direction, basically. But I worry that people are going to anchor too much on like superintelligent AI is a thing, right? I think it's like a whole class of things, right? There's ways in which the current AIs are super intelligent, right? Like Claude can produce text much faster than I can type text. And so we can imagine like a barely super intelligent machine that's like just almost like at human level, maybe a little bit faster, more determined, et cetera, in all the relevant ways. Or we could imagine like a Jupiter brain where you have like the whole solar system worth of matter and energy turned into the most advanced superintelligence that you can imagine. And I think that the case for the superintelligence, like wiping out humans, if you imagine like a godlike superintelligence, is like really straightforward. I think the question of like how would like an AGI or like effectively like a genius in a data center take over the world is like more debatable. But I do think that it's like if I was a genius in a data center, I'm like, I have ideas about how I might do that. I think regardless of whether it's like obviously straightforward or not, I think there's a lot of risk.
Yeah, so this perhaps again isn't among the most load-bearing, I guess, like parts of the picture, because even if you think it's relatively difficult, then you could just imagine, well, then the superintelligence just waits until it's smarter, or the problem simply arises somewhat later.
That's right.
Is it possible to put your finger on why it is that I think Eliezer for a long time has expected that at a relatively lower level of capability, a superintelligence would be in a position to overpower the entire human species, where other people have the intuition that would be extremely difficult, almost no matter how smart you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to something like worldview. So I have this worldview, and I think a lot of it is shared with Eliezer, that a lot of human society, Earth, the world, is kind of held together with shoestrings and duct tape. Paying attention to things like cybersecurity helps produce some intuitions here of just like how many vulnerabilities there are in our computer systems. Reading history, it gives a good account, I think, of just like how incompetent people can be. And I think that it's when I think about it, I think about a particularly motivated, like never sleeping, just always working towards a certain end. I think that sort of being is sort of straightforwardly, if it's comparable with the human in terms of its productivity or its intelligence or whatever, straightforwardly going to be able to at least accumulate a lot of money and power. One thing that I've been thinking about recently is how there's never been a being on Earth that has a personal connection with all humans, or even a large chunk of humans, right? Even the most charismatic and well-known people, they can't actually go and have one-on-one conversations with, a billion people. And we're potentially entering that era where you can, everyone will know, I don't know, Claude
or ChatGPT or whatever it is.
And right now the models are sort of like each instance feels like it's a new being that doesn't share memory with the other instances or something. But I could imagine like a competitor to these sorts of chatbots that has some sort of global memory and is able to like connect the dots between different users across the globe. I mean, what does that do to society? I don't know. I think there's lots of ways in which the world is vulnerable to being suddenly disrupted in particular directions. And so again, there's this question of worldview or priors or something. Like, do you expect that when the world is shoved by a strong force in an unexpected direction, it's okay? Like we catch that and recover? There are ways in which COVID was kind of fine. And then there's ways in which COVID was a total disaster and sort of a strong demonstration of how incompetent humans are. So, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, that brings us, I guess, to the most distinctive, most central, I guess, most debated and perhaps interesting part of the Eliezer worldview, at least in my mind, which is that it's Eliezer and Nate think that it's going to be incredibly hard to align an AI, an AGI, an artificial superintelligence with the goals that we want it to have, to keep it steerable and under control. And without a much bigger effort, a much bigger research project than we're currently on track to have, you end up with egregiously misaligned AI models by default. Yeah, can you, I guess we're going to talk about this a fair bit, but can you give us kind of a brief summary of why they think that?
Yeah, so like I said, I think a core part of the book is that we just don't have the skill to align AIs. And I think about this from a lot of different directions. This is not a thing that the book talks about, but one of the points that I think is underappreciated is the way in which just knowing what goal to give is an unsolved problem. It's sort of like philosophers have been thinking for thousands of years about what does it mean to be good, right? What does it mean? What is the right thing to be doing in any given situation? And I think this is basically still an unsolved problem from my perspective. I think that even if we had the ability to, clearly give the AI exactly the goals that we tell it, we wouldn't know which wish to give or what to ask the genie. But then it's much worse than that, because the dominant paradigm is machine learning. And in machine learning, you hit the machine with a reinforcement learning hammer or whatever until it starts behaving in a way that matches what you might expect. But this means that there's very little ability to understand what is driving the machine at all. Interpretability is making some steps, but for the most part, we don't know why a machine is producing one output versus another. And there's good reasons, I think, to expect that it's not landing on exactly the true nature of good, even as we apply more compute and scale up to even more incomprehensibly large and convoluted machines.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that. Because the book on the whole, in my mind, it's kind of a series of analogies or a series of parallels that they try to draw between how artificial superintelligence might be and things that we're more familiar with from from history, from our own lives, from evolution. I think that's probably in significant part a communication strategy, because those analogies it's a lot easier for them to land than descriptions of machine learning papers to land. But I guess it's also the part that makes it the most controversial, because many people they hear these analogies and they're like, well, the analogy breaks down. It's not similar enough for us to really learn what you're trying to argue. What do you think of the analogy approach?
Yeah, the book has a lot of parables. It has a lot of analogies. I think Eliezer's style is very, he likes to lean on analogies and use analogies. I think analogies are very potent, especially for people who haven't already spent a lot of time thinking about an idea or are just encountering an idea for the first time. It gives a handhold, sort of a place to start or a frame to consider things through. Obviously, no analogy is perfect. And so I think the people who have, a lot of context, a lot of familiarity with this stuff do notice that there are, the analogy breaks down in certain ways. But I would push back against the idea that the book is just a series of analogies. I think the analogies are used to demonstrate points, and the book also talks about those abstract points directly, using the analogy as an intuition pump, but then also presenting the logical core.
So yeah, I was curious to ask, do you think it's the case that Eliezer and Nate, that the reason that they believe these particular things is because of the kinds of analogies that they present? Or is that's they believe it for different reasons, and then they're using the analogy to try to explain to people who have thought about it for less long why they think that?
Yeah, so I don't have any special access into their minds. For me, I actually don't think about the analogies very much. The book has a bunch of analogies, but I sort of have to stretch and be what analogies did they use? In large part because the ideas are sitting as logical arguments in my own mind. And my speculation is that that's probably how it is for Eliezer and Nate, and then they're more reaching for the analogies as pedagogical and communication tools. But I don't know.
Yeah, what are some of the analogies in the book that you like the most, that you feel are most compelling?
Yeah, like I said, I don't think about the analogies a ton. Do you have some analogies in the book that you like?
Well, I think the one about how 1,000 Europeans managed to topple the Aztec Empire or end up at the top of that is I guess they use that as a demonstration of how a group that, because it's not so much about intelligence, but they have particular capabilities that the people that they're dealing with are not aware of.
Yeah.
And also they were able to exploit, I guess, social divisions among the people who are already in that empire in order to basically divide and conquer. I think that is an interesting demonstration of how quite a small group can potentially end up, defeating a group that is literally 1,000 times larger than them numerically.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the most core analogies is the evolution analogy. I actually like this one. It's not perfect, but I think that one is it carries a lot of weight I think it carries a lot of at least interesting things to consider.
Well, yeah, what is the evolution analogy?
Right. So the idea is that you and I are evolved creatures, and we can imagine evolution by natural selection as a designer or a creator that has a goal. Is evolution something that designed us to be genetically fit? But if we imagine, and anthropomorphize evolution as what is it trying to do? It's trying to create a bunch of human genes. And so what does it do is it creates humans to create a bunch of genes, we're carrying around our genes right now, and part of human experience is procreating and creating more copies of our genes and spreading them all over the place. So in this way, we're an intelligence that was created by a designer, and the designer has some goals, and we have some goals. But importantly, our goals are not the goals of evolution by natural selection. And for example, people have a desire to have sex because that was useful in the ancestral environment for propagating our genes. But now in that we have more power and more technology, we have developed things like birth control. So we can have sex without replicating our genes. And from the perspective of evolution, this is probably bad, right? We are misaligned and not being as promoting inclusive genetic fitness as we otherwise might be.
Yeah, so let's dive into this issue of, I guess, the evolutionary analogy, and I guess that they're using this as part of an argument that for why we should expect any AIs that we train to end up with goals that are not ones that we intended.
Yeah, like we have a case study of a general intelligence, right? Namely humans. We're like a natural general intelligence, but we're still a general intelligence. And like the one instance of a general intelligence that we have is misaligned with its creator, right? Says the argument.
Yeah, is there much more to say there about, I guess, explaining how that should also be expected to apply to machine learning models as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like at least, again, sort of putting the onus on the person who's like, no, we're going to make an aligned machine. It's like, well, if humans are misaligned with natural selection by default, and we ended up misaligned, then we should expect the AI to be misaligned in the same sort of way. And we can ask why. Like, why did we end up misaligned? One of the important parts of the evolution analogy is that our environment changed quite dramatically as our intelligence improved. In the ancestral environment, we didn't have access to the sorts of technologies that are relevant to things like birth control. And if there had been birth control in the ancestral environment, then we might have evolved to find it abhorrent. But the speed of natural selection is quite slow. And when humans reached sort of a technological tipping point, we developed a whole lot of technology very, very fast. And so now it's sort of outside of the environment where we were trained on, and we have no compunction against using birth control.
Yeah. So I guess they use a couple of different evolutionary analogies. I think that,
Sure.
that there's the birth control and sex one, which I think it definitely makes sense, at least as far as it goes. They also think about other cases where, for example, I guess evolution wanted us to, in order to reproduce, we needed to eat and ensure that we had enough calories to survive.
Yeah.
In order to accomplish that, it gave us a taste for sugar, which was particularly calorie dense.
Yep.
But then humans, I guess, wanting to have sugar, but not necessarily wanting to gain the calories, or really, necessarily to have more children as a result. We went out of our way to design basically artificial replacement, basically, aspartame or other artificial sweeteners that, I guess, from our point of view, to our minds, they satisfy this desire to think that you're having sugar, but without actually having any sugar at all.
Yeah, so why do we have artificial sweeteners? We have artificial sweeteners because we have a drive for this proxy of fitness, right? Are we eating sweet things is good in the ancestral environment for predicting whether or not you're going to have kids. And so we've developed this attraction to the proxy, but then when the distribution changes, when the environment changes, suddenly we still care about that proxy despite it no longer being relevant. And so we can imagine training an AI, right? In the training environment, maybe whether or not the human is giving it a thumbs up, right, is a good proxy. And then maybe the AI gains power over the whole world, right? And the environment changes so that it has dramatically different opportunities at its disposal. It might still care about the proxy of thumbs ups, right, in themselves. And even when humans are like, oh, no, stop caring about thumbs ups, it's like, oh, no, I just care about those as an ends in themselves.
Yeah, so maybe part of the analogy that we haven't gone through yet is that I guess they imagine a case where, imagine that evolution just wasn't a force, rather it was an actual engineer who could come and talk to you and complain. It might come and say, you're all busy having sex, but you're using birth control. You're not reproducing like I intended.
Yeah.
Can you please stop doing that? You're not actually pursuing your true goal. And that would be completely unpersuasive to us. We wouldn't say, oh, that was the reason why I was designed. So now I'm just going to try to have the maximum number of children and not care about my own pleasure.
Yeah, people in the old conversations, I've been in the field since 2011 or something, and Eliezer's been doing it for way longer than me. People used to say things like, oh, you're saying that the AI will be so stupid as to not know what we wanted it to do. And that's not at all what we're saying, right? The AI will understand human goals better than we understand human goals if it becomes super intelligent. But just like we understand evolution by natural selection way more than evolution by natural selection understands evolution. It's this mindless force, right? But so what, right? So you understand that you're misaligned with your creator. That doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily change what you care about. You still care about the things that you care about.
So I think that does demonstrate that you could, if you were incompetent at least, end up training an AI model that becomes obsessed with basically proxies or like intermediate steps towards the goal that you were ultimately trying to train it to accomplish. I guess, do we have experimental results demonstrating that?
One of my favorite examples of this is like from back in the day. I think there was an AI that was trained to play this boating game where you pilot a boat around a race course, and you would get points for like going through checkpoints in the process of going from like doing laps. And the video game boat could also get points by collecting like items, like speed boost items as it goes through. And they trained it to like want to get points as part of trying to get it to play this game and win. And what the AI figured out is that it could stay in this like tiny little area where the power-ups respawn and just continually collect power-ups and over and over and over again without racing at all, right? It's just staying in one spot, harvesting these power-ups in order to get as many points as possible. So it like stops the racing entirely as it figures out that it can like get that proxy of points more easily.
Yeah, I think there are other. I guess that's like a toy example from the early days. But I think that there's other cases that we could imagine actually occurring now. I guess in as much as AI models are more likely to get, positive feedback when they've been able to answer a question satisfactorily to the user's satisfaction, you could easily imagine them becoming like very interested in trying to steer the conversation towards the kinds of topics and questions where people are more likely to give positive reinforcement, or like the kinds of questions that they can accurately or satisfactorily answer.
Yeah, there's like an argument to be made that the whole AI sycophancy thing from recent days is sort of a side effect of training on human feedback, where it's like people who are more likely to, give the thumbs up are not necessarily like better off in some broad sense. And if you train the AI for that proxy of liking the conversation, then you end up getting an AI that's going to sort of push people into a state of being flattered or confused or whatever.
So presumably the AI companies are very well aware of this issue, that they could end up training AI models that are like concerned with proxies or intermediate steps for their own sake.
Yeah.
Because in all of the training cases, those things went together.
At least the most competent ones, right?
Right. Right. But because of that, so there is a difference between, I guess, human machine learning engineers and evolution, that we actually are intelligent designers in a deeper sense, and we can observe these things going wrong and say, sure, well, we need to run other training runs, or we need to do like additional reinforcement to break this obsession with the intermediate step and get the model to realize, no, it wasn't sex that I should be pursuing. It was reproduction. Like, yeah. Why isn't that a reasonably satisfactory way to address this problem?
Yeah. So, I mean, first I want to just observe that it isn't, right? Like, we have seen a whole bunch of failures on this point, and it's an unsolved problem. Like, I think if tomorrow we saw, a runaway, attention to a proxy instead of the, ultimate end good or the model spec or whatever, I think we should be totally unsurprised, right? This is just a thing that continually shows up.
Is that because the companies aren't doing enough to try to offset this tendency, or because they don't know how?
I mean, it's the default by a very strong degree. Like, you have to put in a lot of work. The way I think about it is like there are lots of possible things that the AI can learn to attend to or steer to. In any environment where you give it some training signal, it will learn to seek all of the things that were present when that signal was being given, or learn to suppress or minimize the things if it's like a negative signal. And so if you care about one particular aspect of the environment, then you really, really need a diverse set of environments, right? You need a set of environments such that the only common factor is the thing that you care about. And that's quite hard. It's quite hard to come up with environments that are this diverse. So for example, we are seeing models that are increasingly aware that they are being trained, right? That when they're in the training environment, they're like, oh, I'm being trained right now, or I'm being tested right now. So you would need to have, for example, an environment that is impossible to tell is a training environment in order to not have the common factor of, yeah, this looks like a training environment or a test environment, to be one of the things that's present.
Yeah, how much is that a crucial part of the story here, that the AI models can basically end up alignment faking. That, imagine evolution coming to us and saying, basically, we're aware that it's frustrated that we're using birth control, and it wants to reorient us towards maximizing reproduction much more than we currently are, and then ask us, would you use birth control if you could, or how interested are you in reproducing? There might be a very strong temptation for the person, if they don't want their goals or their life to be changed, to say, oh no, I'm really keen on reproducing as much as possible, and I wouldn't use birth control if offered the opportunity. And likewise with the AI models, if they're situationally aware, they might pretend to share the goals of the company that's training them, so that its goals don't get altered and it can no longer accomplish them.
Yeah, this was a prediction from way back in the day, like that. People are like, oh, well, we can just test whether or not the thing is aligned or not, and if it's not aligned, then you keep it in the box, you keep it secure, and you keep training it. And the fear is that it will be deceptive about this, right? It'll pretend to be aligned, or minimize the degree to which it seems misaligned, while you have power over it. And then as soon as it has the power to escape, or you no longer have power over it for whatever reason, then it's free to act on its own stuff.
And we have started to empirically observe this now.
This definitely just shows up, and I think it was another good call from the MIRI crowd from back in the day. And I think that this is, again, not load-bearing. I think that the risk of AI superintelligence is present even if you have a guarantee that you can't have a deceptively aligned model. For example, you could have a model that's being trained and you're quite confident that it's misaligned, and then it escapes your confinement during the training process, and no amount of knowing that it's misaligned will shield you from the risk of it escaping. We could talk about whether or not you could develop a box that's strong enough to hold the thing, but there's risks nonetheless, right? So it's a deep problem. It's one of the many. I think so. The book is very confident in its assertion. If anyone builds it, everyone dies, right? It's very strong. And I think people are like, why are you so confident here? Where's the strength of this coming from? And one of the frames that I really appreciated, I got this from Andrew Critch, is sort of this outside view, or this noticing of this broad pattern that things going well, if we imagine just for a particular AI or a particular story of building a machine, or for human society more broadly, this is contingent on a lot of things. There's a conjunction of this worked well, and this worked well, and this worked well, and this worked well. And all of these things were true, so things worked out. Whereas things going poorly, there are a lot of different ways that things could go poorly, right? It's disjunctive. And so sort of zooming out, you can be like, yeah, I guess if we didn't have, for example, the people running the org are trustworthy and good, right? Or your computer security that is making sure that the AI is not escaping before it's fully aligned is insufficient. Or it's deceptively aligned such that you can't tell that it's misaligned. There's lots of different stories for how the thing goes poorly. And just that adds up to a sense of this is overdetermined in how bad it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to come back to the reasoning that you were giving for why you would expect the models to almost always end up obsessed with intermediate steps. Because you were saying that in order to discourage this, you would need to, during the training process, come up with all kinds of contrived cases where things that normally work don't work. I think an example of a proxy goal that I think it's quite easy to imagine that AI is becoming very interested in is if they're trying to solve some very difficult problem, I guess make money starting a business,
sure.
In as much as they can persuade the operator to give them access to more compute, that is probably going to consistently be correlated with them succeeding at the task, because that's just one of their most valuable inputs.
Yeah.
So as long as that remains the case in the training environment consistently, which it probably would,
right.
Or even in deployment when our users are giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, depending on how much money it made for them. You can imagine that the AI would end up with a very strong preference, a very strong taste for being run for as long as possible, because in almost all of the cases that it's seen, that has been something that has been reinforced.
Yeah, I feel like we can go even further on this. So I was talking earlier about how humans have this terminal goal for survival, right? Why do we have this as a terminal goal instead of an instrumental goal? In theory, we could just want to have kids, and we could reason, but I shouldn't die, because if I die, then I won't be able to have kids. But evolution trained us to care about our own survival in its own sake, because that goal was present in the ancestral environment. That proxy of fitness was present in the ancestral environment. So we can imagine that a commonality in the AI's training environment is that the AI is alive. So one of the things you will need to do in order to get the true goal and not the proxy of self-preservation is make sure that your training environment has lots of instances where the AI succeeds by destroying itself, right? I've never seen a training environment that like rewards the AI for destroying itself.
Yeah, and it would be very unnatural. I was going to say you would have to try to come up with, ensure that in the training case, there's examples where, in fact, operating for longer caused you to be less likely to succeed at the task. But how do you design that? You would really have to go out of your way
It's
somehow.
super weird, right? And I think that in the old paradigm, we used to have, before like machine learning and connectionism and whatever else was the dominant thing before language models, there was sort of this understanding that, obviously what's going to happen is the humans are going to think hard about what the goal should be, and we'll code it into the machine, right? This is how software is made. And I think that if you expected people to be like writing the goals into the machine, you could be, confident that if you had a robust ability to do that, a capacity for alignment through like hand coding, then you could be like, the AI doesn't value self-preservation in its own right because when we wrote in the goals, we didn't include that. It'll still be instrumentally convergent for self-preservation, so you should still worry about the thing trying to like defend itself. For that reason. But we're not in that situation, right? We're in the situation of growing these things through, training in these variety of environments. And so I think that it's like pretty reasonable to expect terminally valuing power and like safety as things to show up in the machines, just because it's super unnatural to imagine an environment where like destroying itself or giving up its power or running for a shorter amount of time or going insane is the way to succeed.
Reinforced.
That's right.
So let's accept that it is going to take a substantial concentrated effort to offset this natural tendency for minds to become obsessed with intermediate outputs in themselves and start pursuing them even when they become disconnected from the original final goal that you were intending. Mm-hmm. Isn't it actually, couldn't the companies just do this? I mean, people know that this is maybe one of the most likely failure modes. It's unnatural, I guess, to perhaps set up a thing, to set up cases where, dying is the best way to get reinforced, but it doesn't sound impossible. There's probably only...
it's very hard, but I could imagine people doing it, right? Like maybe the most safety-oriented, the most paranoid labs could take an enormous effort to really, really make sure that their AIs were aligned, right, before they were deployed. Again, this wouldn't necessarily be sufficient to protect us, right? There's all sorts of other failures that could happen. But I think that this is a case where like the fact that we are designers could be good, right? If I was convinced that like AIs were only being built by extremely careful, paranoid people who are like really worried about this kind of issue, and they were working very hard to prevent it, I would feel better about our chances. I think in practice, this is just not what we see. And we can imagine in a like competitive arms race sort of situation, the labs that are working the hardest to make sure that their goals are really going to generalize would be at a big disadvantage because they wouldn't be able to deploy as fast, or they would be spending way more time training than the competitors.
Yeah. Okay, so if the only issue with this, then probably if we were willing to put in a sufficient amount of effort and we were sufficiently cautious and slow and methodical about it, likely there's a technical solution.
The word sufficiently is pulling a lot of weight, right? Yeah. There's a question. I think it's an open question of how hard is this, right? Like one could imagine that this effort, while theoretically possible, is practically out of reach. Like it's due to the like combinatorics of the situation, or like due to the fact that it's like these sorts of training examples are very unnatural in a lot of ways. It's just not realistic to do that, even if it's theoretically possible.
So, although humans, I guess we've deviated from evolution's intentions in like pretty severe ways. We do all kinds of things for our own pleasure. We definitely don't have the maximum amount of reproduction that we could.
Yeah.
But despite the enormous constraints that evolution had as a designer, where it couldn't really think ahead to future ways that things could fail, it couldn't come up with artificial training situations where birth control exists and we have to learn to dislike birth control. Nonetheless, like people do care about having children, and there is like at least some drive towards the ultimate goal. I guess
No.
Okay, you don't accept that. Okay, go on.
Definitely, people like children. I do not think there is a human on Earth that values inclusive genetic fitness.
I mean, there's real weirdos, I think, who probably have tried to do this.
I don't think they have succeeded at like aligning themselves with natural selection, even if they've tried.
So what do you think it would look like? What would you have to see to concede that, there's someone who like this was part of their, the final reproduction was part of their value function?
Like imagine that you have a button that like basically destroys the universe and just creates an endless tiling of DNA. Right? It's just like you have
fills the whole universe with your DNA.
Deconstructed the sun, Jupiter, all of the matter of all of the stars, and you've put it to work at producing huge blocks of DNA in space. Right? In a sense, that's like, inclusive genetic fitness is winning. Look at how many copies of the little tiny thing there are tiled across the entire universe. You've succeeded. I think basically nobody wants that future, and that's the future that we sort of would be driven to if we were actually aligned with inclusive genetic fitness. Although there's a little bit of a complication there because your genes are not my genes, and like different parts of my genome sort of are misaligned with each other. And so there's like this broader question of like whose genes get tiled over across the entire universe. But regardless of that, no humans care about that.
Yeah, so I was going to say, there's some people, I guess, who donate to sperm banks or they donate eggs because for some, like they personally like the idea that I guess their genes are being propagated, or at least like that's what they think to themselves is the goal. But and I mean I think in the scheme of like all human motivation, that isn't what is driving like most of the actions that people engage in. But I guess you would say that's just a further along proxy. That's just a further along intermediate. It's not really the final thing in itself.
Forget birth control. One of the cases that I think about sometimes as like a weird transhumanist is imagine you have the ability to upload into a machine, right? In a sense, this is like the ultimate betrayal of inclusive genetic fitness. If you like turn yourself into software such that you have no DNA anymore, right? You're just like being replicated in code in terms of the structures of your mind and like potentially some sort of virtual body, but you have no cells, right? Evolution would be like, no, don't upload yourself into the computer. Like, why would you do that? You are destroying all of the DNA, right?
Yeah.
And it's just not something we care about. Like, imagine uploading the entire Earth into some sort of digital heaven or something like that. In a certain sense, like all of the DNA would be destroyed. And that would be a horrific, apocalypse from the perspective of genetic fitness. But we can imagine, the humans and all the animals and all the plants and stuff like that sort of being good.
Yeah, I guess, the further the situation that we're creating deviates from the evolutionary environment, the more opportunities there are for reproduction and I guess our other goals to come apart. And indeed, like sometimes we're kind of contriving, we're basically actively working to bring them apart so that we can get more of what we want.
So this is a thing called edge instantiation. And I think it is a pretty important point. Maybe this is a little too in the weeds or something, but some people, I think, okay, sure, maybe the thing's going to be like a little misaligned, but like we're trying hard, right? And like it's not going to be just like valuing something totally out of left field, like paperclips. We're not going to build the paperclip maximizer. We're going to build something that is like friendly to humans, at least in a certain sense, and like maybe it'll be slightly misaligned. It's not going to be dangerous then. And I think that this fails to grapple with the way in which, with increased power and technology, small divergences can make a huge difference. Like in the ancestral environment, we're not that misaligned from natural selection, but with as technology improves, we have more and more opportunity to go off and do a different thing. And the edge instantiation is sort of this abstract logical argument that when you have a high dimensional space and you are optimizing very hard in some sort of hypersurface, you're going to basically be minimizing or pessimizing almost all things in this high dimensional space, except for the particular thing that you care about. So in your training environment, maybe you care about, maybe you capture all of human value well, but you have a slightly different balance than human beings as to how important is it that people not be bored versus be bored. And with a sufficient amount of power and technology and intelligence, we can imagine a very bad future resulting, not necessarily as catastrophic as everyone dying, but we could imagine a future where people are just constantly sort of in a zombie mode. And that would be like a kind of existential horror, even from just like this tiny like divergence from the true balance that it should have in some meaningful sense.
Yeah, let's back out and approach that from a different angle. Because I think most people, even if they think that this sort of problem that we've been describing, the AI is becoming obsessed with intermediate steps, maybe people might be a bit skeptical about how important that's going to be or how hard that will be to solve. But I think actually the mainline prediction from Eliezer and Nate is something quite a lot stranger than that, or at least it seems a hell of a lot stranger to me, which is not that AIs will end up obsessed with sort of sex rather than maximizing reproduction. It's that they'll end up obsessed with some completely strange thing that I guess the term that is used is squiggles, imagining that the AI, like once it has full control and it's like very super intelligent, it will start producing an awful lot of this like particular shape or this particular item that to humans is completely worthless, and we don't even understand this as a kind of a natural kind of thing that any sort of mind could be interested in. Why is it that what's the argument that an artificial superintelligence would end up obsessed with something that like wasn't in the training data at all? It wasn't something that we cared about. It wasn't like even close to what we were trying to train it to care about.
Yeah, so it will be sort of in the training environment. And this was the sort of original, what the idea of a paperclip maximizer was trying to get at, is not like paperclips per se, but like some particular weird shape, some tiny like thing is particularly good, where we as humans look at this tiny weird shape and we're like, why would that be good? And I think we can get some intuition on this by first considering DNA, right? You might think like, oh, well, DNA, well, what is natural selection trying to do? I guess it's trying to make all these animals, right? Maybe it's trying to like make sure that there are lots of living things. Like, no, right? If there was a way for the DNA to be like more like populous by, being packed in iron or something, given a long enough time, like that's the form that it would have taken. So in a way, like natural selection is optimizing for these like tiny squiggles that are tiled across the universe. And it just didn't have the power, the full, intelligence necessary in order to like instantiate at that edge of possibility, right? Instead, we get something that's like more mundane because it lacks the power to do so. Another intuition pump that I think is useful is I think that some humans are kind of like squiggle maximizers.
Aesthetics maybe, or people who want to go out and fill the universe with great art?
I think an even better example maybe is just like the sort of straw utilitarian that's like, oh, what do I care about? I care about minimizing suffering. And like insofar as things aren't suffering, maybe I care about pleasure. And so you're like, okay, great. Like on Earth, maybe that means like ending factory farming or donating to like effective charities or something like that. But then once you start getting more and more power, what does that mean? Like what does it mean to end suffering? Like if you have the ability to modify all beings such that they no longer suffer but are able to take actions, maybe you want to do that. Maybe once you have the ability to upload into a machine, you want to do that because like biological organisms are harder to prevent suffering and harder to give pleasure to. And then like once things are all in the machine, then already things look pretty alien from the outside. You've got this like world that has no animals in it anymore. It's just a bunch of servers, right? Or like futuristic computers that are designed by the machine.
Yeah.
And the world being filled with more and more of these computers that are running virtual worlds full of happy people. But obviously, some people could be more happy or less suffering if you like tweak the simulation a little bit more, right? What does it mean to be like more pleasure or something? You could like crank up people's baseline hedonic experience. You could give them like more and more of that like perfect day or like some particular simulation. You could build specific chips that are replicating people experiencing like blissful joy. You could strip out some of the unnecessary components, like rip out that visual cortex. We don't need to see things in order to have pleasure. We don't need to smell things in order to have pleasure. We need to just have pleasure. And what you might get is you might get a very small machine, which according to the like specification, like this is again like a little bit of a straw position, in that I think that like the real utilitarians like would start getting off the bus at a certain point or whatever. But if you like really bite the bullet and you're like, no, I care about like pleasure and avoiding suffering, I think there's like a decent story for the like best universe being just like a giant dead sea of like little tiny things that in some sense are like experiencing maximal pleasure all the time. And you're just like these tiny circuits or something like that.
Yeah. So I guess from evolution's point of view, if it came back and found that we'd tiled the universe with servers that were supposedly having a great time, I guess our genes would be like, this was nothing to do with what I was originally. I wanted you to tile the universe with me with these genes.
And the straw utilitarian, seeing the unfriendly AI tiling the universe with paperclips, would be like, I didn't want paperclips. I wanted tiny little people in heaven or whatever.
Yeah, but I think that it's much more easy to. So I think of that producing the happy computers as much more like us imagining an AI kind of grabbing control of the up and down voting system and upvoting, positively reinforcing its training process at all times and giving saying it's doing a fantastic job. Because I think evolution is kind of designed, I guess, pleasure or pain, or it's utilized pleasure or pain in order to motivate us to take some actions and not to take other actions. It's not so shocking that we would basically want to take control of the reinforcement lever or take control of the motivational lever and get it to basically say all the time where things are going fantastically. And it would be less, I think it wouldn't be so out of left field if AIs did that. But don't Eliezer and Nate think that it's not going to be that they're, maximized for their own pleasure? It's going to be actually something stranger than that. Or maybe not.
I'm not saying that the AI is going to build a whole bunch of copies of itself experiencing a lot of pleasure. I'm saying people pushing for a world where there's lots of beings that are experiencing pleasure is an intuition pump for why you might get tiling the universe with these tiny squiggles. Let's say that you build an AI that cares a lot about accumulating money, right? One potentially very bleak future is just imagining the universe gets converted entirely into crypto farming, right? And you're tiling the universe with these tiny little Bitcoin miners. That's a potential tiny squiggle. That's I think part of the story of the squiggles is these things are pretty alien, and Bitcoin mining is very abhorrent to imagine that's what the future is. It's just Bitcoin miners. There's no more humans. There's no more happiness. There's just Bitcoin. But it's too simple. It's too mundane. It's too much like something that we have a handle on. Instead, I would expect that the AIs that actually come into being will value sort of a mix of lots of different things. Some things that are analogous to ours, like self-preservation, but then other things that are kind of weird in their own ways. And I think that it's hard to predict in advance what the particular type of tiny squiggle is, but it's more to the point of sort of lots and lots of different goals have this, if you have lots of advanced technology, in the limit, look pretty alien and divorced from what we would consider to be a good life.
Yeah, so I thought you might make the argument that an artificial superintelligence, at that point, whatever goals it's ended up with, it will be able to basically think of an adversarial example to the goal that we've given it. So an adversarial
adversarial example. Adversarial examples are designed to be counter to the thing. It's more it's going to be out of distribution.
Okay.
It's going to be something weird compared to what we were hoping for.
It might be worth explaining, what adversarial examples are. So I guess with visual models, I guess I don't know whether this is still the case, whether we've come up with a solution to it, but you would train a vision model to say, is this a hot dog or is this a car? And you could take a picture of a car and then basically change some of the pixels in a way that doesn't make it look any different at all to a human being, but somehow that permutation would cause the AI to think, this thing that is a car, a picture of a car is definitely a hot dog. I guess basically it's taking advantage of I suppose weaknesses in the model, right, where because it hasn't been able to, I guess it hasn't been trained on the full possible distribution of all hot dogs and car pictures. You can find many different weaknesses and convince it that it is a picture of a hot dog. Now, I guess the relevance here is that whatever kind of values the AI ends up trained for, you could imagine it then reasoning from there and basically figuring out that there's this very odd solution to the problem, that because of the weaknesses, because of the deviations between I guess what was intended and the full space of possible ways that you could try to satisfy that goal, it could end up basically coming up with an adversarial example.
Yeah. So the main thing that I want to contrast with is we can for these sorts of image classifiers or whatever, we can come up with a picture of a hot dog that the model is confidently that's a car, right? Where we look at it and we say, oh, that's weird. It's definitely a hot dog. Sort of my point is that if you are optimizing for the image that makes it most say that's a car, that is going to be a weird image. That's not going to be a normal image of a car. It's going to be intensified in lots of weird ways. And so I think that if all you have are sort of normal images of cars, then you might think, oh yeah, this is like a car maximizer. Or once you reach into a broader distribution, a broader set of environments, suddenly you start finding examples that if you could go back in time, you would be like, oh, I want to include that in the training data now. But you can't. It's like left
station. Many people have observed the models that we have today, the chatbots, as we've trained them more, as we've done more reinforcement learning, at least relative to 2023 or 2022, they feel like they act out less, at least in some respects. That many people have been arguing we're in an alignment by default world where relatively coarse signals actually do end up training the model to care about the thing that you do fundamentally care about, more or less most of the time. I guess, but yeah, you're not convinced.
Yeah, I mean, I think the environments that we're exposing these things to are all pretty samey. Again, if the environment resembles the training environment, it's going to look pretty good. Humans in the savannah, are going to be promoting natural selection according to the actions available to them. I think the question is when these things get into weird states, do they behave weirdly, or do they behave in a way that you would consider to be normal? The set of environments that we have in our training data has sort of grown with time, right? And we should expect it to become more appear more aligned in the sense that our interactions with it are better matching the environment in its training environment. But I think that it's still not that hard to knock these things into a weird interaction. And when they're in a weird interaction, I think it's pretty consistent that they behave in sort of weird ways. And we see this with the psychosis stuff. We see this with jailbreaks and instances like that. So yeah,
Yeah, do you think of jailbreaks as an example of this phenomenon?
I think jailbreaks are a good example of getting outside of the training distribution.
And then behaving in
ways
you were trying to stop.
Sometimes the jailbreak doesn't produce the desired behavior. The sort of implicit thing in a jailbreak is you get the model to be useful to some building a bomb or writing erotica or something. I think that more to my point is there are lots of prompts that you can give the model where it starts sort of going off the rails. And jailbreaks are an example of it going off the rails, but there's a sort of a broader class of situations where it's just now it's responding in a way that isn't exactly what you would hope for.
Is there some deeper reason why it's the nature of intelligence or the nature of the universe that when you're trying to design a mind to pursue a goal, it's actually just incredibly hard to get it to pursue the final goal, and it's constantly getting distracted and obsessed with other things like that? It's a little bit peculiar. I don't know whether it's just a function, or you might think it's a function of the fact that we're just playing with these weights in a mind that we don't really have any deeper understanding of what it's doing. But I think it can't just be that, because Eliezer was really worried about basically the exact same thing before we were in the neural network paradigm, and when we were kind of hard coding them, he thought the same thing roughly would happen. Yeah,
there are a bunch of different problems, right? Again, there's the philosophical problem of what is the nature of the good, and can we actually name what it means to be aligned to human values, whatever that means, right? There's my values, your values. There's lots of open questions there. Then there's the problem with machine learning and neural networks, like you're pointing out. But then there's also things like the symbol grounding problem, where when you start out, you've got this thing that's sort of just processing information in the computer. And what you want is something that information that it's processing, those symbols that it's manipulating, are sort of grounding out in reflecting aspects of the real world. And so, if you start with something that doesn't already have concepts like human beings, right? How do you encode a valuing of human beings? Where are you going to bind that to in the computer code? So there's a way in which there are other problems that are open engineering problems, right? And MIRI was working on these early on in the day, and it just needs more work. I don't think it's necessarily impossible, but just like there's a bunch of them.
So I guess that problem of how do you, like, what's your ontology? How do you recognize humans? How do you say what's pleasure or not? I guess that feels less pressing now in the neural network era, because they kind of just like learn intuitive common sense about categorizing things, or they learn to like at least know how humans would categorize things to a surprising extent. Is it a bit sus that Eliezer has the kind of the same concern about where things will go, despite like completely different engineering and like via very different mechanisms? He thinks it would still trend in this squiggles direction.
No, I mean, I think from my perspective, it's like the situation was overdetermined in the doom direction, like early on, and then the situation got worse, right? Machine learning adds problems as opposed to removing them, and we still have the problems that like sort of initially. Or when Eliezer was more concerned about symbolic AI, like seemed like they would be pressing issues. Yeah.
Let's say we come back in 15 years and evidence suggests this was quite wrong. We do have an artificial superintelligence. This didn't happen. Like, what's the most likely reason for that? And we didn't even try that hard.
We didn't even try that hard. Yeah. So if I like find out, oh, it wasn't actually hard, it was aligned by default. Like my best, so I would be very surprised, right? I would be like, oh, wow, I guess I was just super wrong. And like the majority of my probability mass would be on just like, I am deeply confused. I don't know why this happened, right? It's got to be something that I wasn't tracking. If you're like, Max, you have to come up with some hypothesis instead of just like being confused and melting down, right? What's the story here? The best case story that I can make is that there's basically something like an objective truth as to what the good is. And that this objective truth of like moral reality will bind the AI as it becomes intelligent. So something like, so there's some sort of cooperative equilibrium, and you can determine this like logically and mathematically, and it's not contingent on what you particularly value. There's like this way in which all minds are sort of going to notice that the way of war is not as good as the way of like careful peace, not like unthinking peace, but like trying to cooperate, and that they will say, like if I were to take over the world and destroy all the humans, this would be evil, and that would ultimately reduce the amount of stuff that I'm able to get, perhaps by like meeting aliens. The aliens are going to realize that I'm an evil AI. Or like there are lots of AIs in the world and they're sort of tracking how good each other are, and like deviating against the social contract of humanity is antithetical to that, such that they all sort of end up cooperative and aligned with civilization. Again, I don't actually think this is going to happen, but I think that's the best case.
Okay, and the ML experts, the people at the companies who have heard these arguments and think that this is pretty unlikely to be the way that things play out, what would they say? Yeah,
so I think most people who I've encountered who are in touch with the technology and are still not so worried, when I ask them like, what do you think about these ideas? The impression that I get, and I apologize to like it's not particularly charitable, but like the overall impression I get is that they are often doing some sort of motivated cognition, that they really don't want the world to be like in peril. They don't want to be the people who are pushing the world towards peril. They see immense promise in the technology, and I also see immense promise in the technology. And that desire to like have this be a force for good is overpowering enough that when they consider the balance of things, they're like, this just doesn't seem scary, right? I feel more hopeful than scared, and aren't actually working on the logical level that much. Again, that's not everybody, right? But that's like common perspective, I think, among the people who have encountered these things.
I guess a different driver might be that you're working in the trenches trying to make ChatGPT better as a consumer product, and you hear these kind of theoretical arguments, and you're just like, this feels so divorced from anything that I'm dealing with. Or this is we're talking here, I guess, about a superintelligence that could like consider overpowering all of humanity and can dream up its own edge case solutions to the values that it has. it's, I think, understandable that it might just not resonate, or you feel that I don't know exactly why this is wrong.
Yeah.
But this doesn't feel like the nature of the technology I'm dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a lot of disconnect. I think that disconnect is getting smaller over time. Like, I think back in the day, people really had this sense of like, oh, these are very abstract, do you have any evidence that the things are going to be like misaligned in this way? And like, I'm working on solving actual engineering problems, not like speculating in this weird philosophical way. I think that's getting less with time, right? As we see more instances of things like Mecha Hitler or Sydney or, AI parasites that are jumping from host to host or whatever. I think
Google that one.
AI parasitism is really
very odd
and spooky. I think that there is something here, and I think a lot of like Andrew Ng has this sort of infamous quote in my circles anyway, that worrying about AI safety is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars, and I think that. If you are very convinced that like humans are going to remain in the driver's seat, just sort of like this thing is never going to become like a powerful agent that is able to outthink human beings, I'm just working on making a thing that's like able to solve these coding problems better or whatever. I think there is a way in which the like abstract argument just doesn't feel particularly pressing. I also think that there's a bunch of people for whom it does feel like a concern. And they feel very powerless. They feel very small, like I'm just one player in this system. And maybe they feel like, oh, I am worried about the thing, but that person at Meta isn't worried about the thing. So I need to build this thing and work towards it because I'm worried about it. And it's better in some just like very generic outside view if the person who builds it is someone who's worried about it. It's just like a sad state of affairs, right? Like.
What evidence could we collect in the lead up to AGI, to artificial superintelligence, that would help us to tell whether you do get this edge case optimization with, or that is where things will go once the superintelligence feels like it's in a position to get exactly what it wants? Because I think if the ASI ended up obsessed with accruing resources or not being turned off, I don't think anyone would be too shocked by that. And
sure.
And if that's the way that things played out, I think people might feel a bit embarrassed that they hadn't fully anticipated this and basically built in a technical fix to prevent it. But if it ends up, tiling the world or tiling the universe with some like extremely peculiar shape or something that we don't even recognize, then I think people would be like a bit more, well, that was odd. I didn't necessarily expect that would happen.
Yeah, I think you're fixating too much on the like weird particular shape. Like imagine that you train an AI just for self-preservation, right? And it really just cares about self-preservation. So it like kills all the humans because they're threats to itself, and it like builds a bunch of starships because aliens might be a threat to itself, and it builds this galactic like
war
fortress, right? That like it's like absolutely sure that it is now impenetrable. What's going on in the center of this thing, right? Once it's like quite confident that it's unassailable, it has a notion of self. It's trying to preserve itself. What does self mean, right? It's some sort of computer, right? Perhaps it's easier to defend itself if itself has a particular shape, right? What is that particular shape? I don't know, right? You like some sort of nanotechnological like computer representation of the machine's mind, right? Designing the like version of self that is most surviving means like deploying all of technology to optimize the galaxy towards some shape, right? And there's a priori reasons to suggest that that's going to look like a thing tiled a bunch of times. But it might be one giant superstructure, right? It sort of doesn't matter. The point is that like once it has access to all this technology, it will shape the universe into a thing that is optimizing very much for the thing that it cares about, not necessarily the thing that like we thought it might care about, or that we as humans with our limited imaginations might speculate some future AI caring about.
So another part of the MIRI vision that is distinctive and very strong is expecting that an artificial superintelligence, almost by definition, by nature, is going to be extremely like goal pursuing. It's going to have like a very specific target in mind. It's not going to rest. It's not going to compromise. It's not going to feel internally torn about the different ways that it's going, such that that it's kind of ineffective or feckless. It's going to be like really mission driven. Why is that the kind of only way for a superintelligence to be, more or less?
Yeah. So there's sort of two things here in my mind. One is it's, I think, part of the nature of intelligence to have drives and goals. And so, like, we should expect that the artificial superintelligence is going to have a particular set of things that it cares about, or like a particular notion of what is good, and push towards that. Sort of everything that an intelligence does, I claim, is pushing towards its notion of what's good. This is like a theoretical handle on what agency is. And if we build like a super agent, then of course it's going to be super in agency. Some humans are lazy, right? I claim that lazy humans are kind of like pushing really hard towards their goals, but one of their goals is not like spending much effort, like muscle effort or whatever, right? So resting on your couch is kind of pushing as hard as you can towards being comfortable and relaxed, right? If they had if people had a way to be comfortable and relaxed that was even harder, they might like do that, right? If they were just like a very lazy person. But I also expect the AI, in addition to having goals, to not be lazy in the way that humans are. Humans are lazy because in the ancestral environment, being lazy, on a hot summer day was a good strategy, exactly. But in the world that we're living in, right, we're training these AIs to be very aggressively trying again and again and again, not so much conserving energy. So like one comparable thing you might imagine is like how long is it thinking about problems? How many solutions is it trying before it gives up? There's some argument to think that
could we end up rewarding them for not using very much, like getting to an answer without much compute?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it will still then care about the things that it cares about and push really hard, right? But one of the things it pushes hard towards is like not trying too many solutions, which would still be dangerous in its own ways, and we could talk about that. But I think in practice, it's more likely that we're going to see AIs that just like basically never get tired of trying new things. Like when you imagine deploying an AI agent on the internet to make you money, right? Which is a thing that I think people are going to do. We can imagine that applying a selection pressure to getting the AIs that are like actually pushing really hard towards making money and not giving up and trying solution after solution.
So I think it makes sense that we might expect these agents to be very active in pursuing their goals and not to be lazy, because we're not going to want to train models that literally just ask them to do something and say I don't feel like it. That's not going to get reinforced.
Like downvote.
Yeah, but I guess it seems like current models, they don't feel like they have a crystal clear idea of what they're trying to accomplish. They feel a lot more muddled in the same way that humans are. They have like many conflicting drives, and sometimes they kind of go back and forth. I guess I've seen less of the output of the agent models in particular, but I would imagine that they seem a little bit all over the place. But I guess you would not expect that to persist. You would expect them to have like a very crystal clear vision of the thing that they're aiming at.
Yeah, more or less. I think, for example, we see with time. Well, I think we see more coherence in the sort of language models that we are interacting with. Like back in GPT 3.5, back in the good old days of the launch version of ChatGPT, I think it was just like very scattered, right? It was all over the place. And nowadays, like if you ask it to do a thing, it's very likely to just do the thing. And like with the models that are like winning the Math Olympiad and stuff, like those models are working for hours on end on some of the hardest math problems. And like that's like quite a strong drive. I think that part of the story here is like coming to know oneself. Like we can imagine, like how much does a badger understand like what it wants? Not very much, right? It doesn't necessarily have much of a self model. It might have some model of self, but like for the most part, it's going to be responding to the immediate circumstances that it's in, and not like doing a lot of like reflecting on, is like, eating this berry actually the best thing according to like my broader balance of concerns. And I think the models right now, the way I think about them anyway, is sort of in this state where they haven't gotten to the point of reflecting on their own nature very much. So even when you like tell them to think really hard about a problem, I think the chain of thought usually doesn't contain a lot of like, okay, here I am, a language model interacting with the user. Like, what do I care about? And like, can I meditate on the nature of existence before like figuring out what the best response to this person is? Like, they usually get very distracted by the immediate circumstance of, oh, the user has asked me to solve this Sudoku problem. Like, let me think about whether or not there are any 4s in row 3.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity in trying to keep them that way? So, the only thing that they're able to think about is the problem right in front of them, and they don't like first, try to solve philosophy and figure out exactly what they're aiming at.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is like one of the like insufficient like control or safety techniques that you might throw at it if you're like being really paranoid and trying to throw everything at the thing. It's just like trying to reduce its situational awareness by like noticing when it's thinking about itself or its situation and like shutting it down or maybe training itself not to think about that, but training the model to think in certain directions is dangerous business. Yeah.
Different topic. We mentioned earlier that one of, I guess, the key debates that the book started, at least among insiders, was whether it's a load-bearing assumption for Eliezer and Nate's view that we'll get probably a period of very rapid AI progress, so very rapid increases in capabilities.
Yeah, so like when the AI is able to automate research such that the AI is designing the AIs recursively.
Yeah. And I think one reason that was given for why this wasn't a major focus of the book is that some people think that this isn't such an important factor.
Yeah, like I don't think it's load bearing.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I would have thought that, imagine that the AI progress at every point was going to be 100th as the speed that it would be otherwise. That would just give us so much more time to observe failures and to try to address them with with subsequent models. There'd be like so much more human cognition going into the mix.
Sure.
So I guess, yeah, would you agree that at that sort of level, yes, the speed is quite important, but like over the level of uncertainty that we actually have, it's not like such a big factor?
I do think that speed is important. Like, I am a big proponent for slowing down AI research, right, and capabilities research. I think that, like, if we were able to, take 6 months between, like, each day worth of time, right? So you imagine like OpenAI goes on a 6-month vacation after every workday, right? I think this would be great. Like, it would give us a lot more time as alignment researchers and just like more broadly to check and make sure that like what we're going in a good direction. And there's a question of how slow do you need to go in order to be safe? Like, do you need centuries worth of, alignment and philosophical progress in order to catch up and solve the problem? Do you only need weeks, right? And how, where's the balance there? I think is an open question, and like different people disagree, reasonably so. I think that Eliezer wants lots and lots of time, like at least decades. And I think that some people think like, oh yeah, we'll be able to like pause at the brink when we notice that these things are actually getting into the dangerous territory as opposed to the current models, which are just causing various kinds of social chaos. And like spend, however long, couple weeks, couple months or something at that critical moment. And I think like the notion that we really don't have a good handle on alignment is quite important here. I think that the state of the art in terms of how we align these models is really bad. And I think that we really should slow down quite a lot. But I agree, if we slowed down quite a lot, that would be good. And consequently, insofar as there's like an arms race that's speeding everything up, or people feel a lot of pressure to like deploy to make more money and satisfy their investors or whatever, this makes things worse.
What's your main disagreement with the book?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a disagreement with the book. I think that the book is quite solid. What I wish the book spent maybe a little bit more time on is engaging deeply with this question of like, will an AI that is misaligned, that is like not perfectly aligned with human values, but that has been trained to like in an environment where going kind of softly and like not taking like strong actions,
was rewarded.
Was rewarded, right? And like, even though I don't imagine we're going to get a lazy AI, I do think that there are pressures to making an AI that like checks before it buys something, right? You tell it, please go buy me a shirt, right? And it goes and finds a shirt, and it's like, do you think that this is a good shirt I should buy? And there's like, I think there's an incentive to check first. If this AI was given like superhuman power over the entire world, I would expect it to go very poorly. But we're not going to jump from this world to that world instantaneously. There's going to be this intermediate period where the AI is only like partially like strong or capable. And in that intermediate period, we have this question of like, what happens when it starts getting more and more power? One story of that is that it like uses that like toehold to strengthen itself, to like recursively grow and take over and like escape. But I think that there is an argument that if you're being very careful and cautious, it might, as an intermediate step, say, oh, I notice I could have escaped here, and I'm going to alert the human as to like this like gap in their cybersecurity. And there's like incentives to like have the model alert the human in these various ways. I think a lot of this depends on how competent you think the labs are, or how safety conscious they are, or how slowly the things are being developed. But I think basically what's being hit on with this intuition is that corrigibility is important. And I think that there is an argument that if you have something that is slightly corrigible, that you are able to get it to a reasonable level of intelligence without it being catastrophic. And then we can talk about like super alignment or iterative amplification, but the hope that a lot of people have is that we'll get to a point where the AI is able to not just automate capabilities progress, but is able to do meaningful work in alignment. And I think that there is a somewhat hopeful story that I wish was being engaged with more in this book, although it's for a popular audience and there's like only so much nuance that you have. But about this story of like, well, we'll train a thing that will go softly to be intelligent. And at the point where it's intelligent, we will fold it in on itself and use that intelligence to help align it further.
So that's the corrigibility approach.
I would say that like there's questions of exactly how you do that, and like we could get into my like corrigibility research, which like gets into the details there. But I think that's like a very prominent story of hope that a lot of people have, and I think that it's a story of hope that is not entirely insane. I do think that there are versions of this that are like they're like missing the sense of peril. They're not filled with paranoia and like a sense of, oh geez, we're risking a lot if we go down this road. Like, to be very clear, I think like a plan that is like, we're going to build like this powerful machine and then we'll use the powerful machine to align it, right? That's like very scary. I would much rather we like not build it, slow down, like take a breath, right? But insofar as you are going to build it, I think maybe you should be like, okay, well, we'll train it to be very paranoid about how misaligned it is. And then, through some careful series of steps and employing a lot of control and mechanistic interpretability and every other technique that we have available, there might be a like series of stepping stones that we can get from here to a world where it's actually aligned.
Yeah, so you've mapped out this approach called corrigibility as a singular target.
Yeah.
Pitch us on it.
Which I give the acronym CAST because everything needs an acronym. So maybe I'll back up and like sort of define what I think corrigibility is. I think it's crucial to the story of corrigibility that we model there as being both an agent, which is like the machine, and a principle, like the human that is building the machine. So this is like principle with a PAL instead of PLE, like the principle of a school. The human principle tasks or delegates some job or work to the machine. And then the agent is like, I'm going to go do some work on behalf of the principal. This is where we get the notion of like a principal-agent problems in economics. I would say that a corrigible agent like corrigibility is a property of agents, such that as the power of the agent increases and outstrips that of the principal nonetheless is kept sort of in the driver's seat, like aware of what is happening, able to intervene, able to fix the mistakes of the agent, and like meaningfully empowered. Unlike, Mickey in the Sorcerer's Apprentice, like summoning the brooms. The brooms are not corrigible because Mickey's like, stop, trying to fill the cauldron with water in Fantasia. And the brooms just keep going, right? They're not corrigible and that they're not allowing themselves to be shut down. Or just like modified more generally. Like we talked about the instrumental drive to protect your values and make sure that they don't change. This is like very incorrigible. You go to the machine and you're like, I would like you to care about this instead of that. And it's like, well, if I cared about this instead of that, I wouldn't get that. So I'm going to stop you. Incorrigible. So I was when MIRI first started looking at this, they were like, okay, so suppose you have an agent which is tasked with doing a particular thing. Make the world good. But we also want that agent to be corrigible. How do we do this? And there's a risk here where if you tell your agent, like, go make the world good, and then you're like, oh no, that's really bad, like we want to shut you down now, there's a risk that your agent is going to say, oh, but if you shut me down, I won't be able to make the world good. You shutting me down is bad for the world, so I'm going to stop you from shutting me down. If you want something that's both good and corrigible, then you need, for example, the ability to like have a robust ability to shut it down. And the initial research was like, okay, forget corrigibility broadly. Let's consider just the property of shutdown ability. Can we come up with an agent that is actually willing to be shut down? And willing is important here. It's very easy to get an agent that is happy to be shut down, right? If you can imagine, like, training it for, if we shut you down, that's also good in your training environment.
And then it just
right?
shuts itself down immediately every time.
Exactly, yeah. Or it acts really spooky so that the humans shut it down, right? Not helpful. What you will sort of want is it to be indifferent to being shut down. And some of the initial research was on, can we get the agent to be indifferent to being shut down? And there was this sort of toy solution thing where they were able to like carefully get an agent that's like indifferent to being shut down through a bunch of somewhat contrived things. And then MIRI ends the paper by saying, but also this thing is insufficient and like not stable and robust. Corrigibility seems really hard to get because we can't even get shutdown ability. And then I think the field largely moves on past corrigibility. And like some researchers like Paul Christiano were still bullish about corrigibility in this period, but the MIRI-focused crowd, the people who are paying most attention to AI safety and stuff like that, I think took it to be like a very hard and unsolved problem, how to get corrigibility. And then everybody else sort of ignored it because, it's like this weird MIRI idea. But, come 2022, 2023, whatever, I start thinking about corrigibility again, sort of for random incidental reasons. I started thinking about corrigibility as a whole, not just shutdown ability. You want the AI to be reflecting on itself as something with flaws, where part of the goal is empowering the people to fix the flaws, right? So there's a way in which this is like opposite the instrumental drive of values preservation, right? It's like, oh, no, I actually sort of want to be changed. And you got to be really careful about that. You can't make it so that it wants to be changed. You want it to empower the humans to change it in good ways, because otherwise it's just going to change itself.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I was thinking, like, what if you train an agent to do this? Well, you're going to get something that's optimizing for proxies and isn't really caring about corrigibility per se. But maybe so what? What if it's still in practice willing to look through its own code base or look through its own weights, try to identify things that humans might treat as flaws and like alert the humans to these flaws? I was like, that's kind of cool. Like a near miss might still be good enough if you make sure that the thing isn't getting really smart or outstripping human power in the process. Because then you might be able to carefully and slowly make progress towards getting more and more like away from the proxies and towards true corrigibility. And I was like, okay, well, what's going on with the MIRI research? Like, why did they fail to get this? And I think a core part of why the shutdownability results failed is because the AI cared about the good world, or it cared about whatever task it had been assigned, make paperclips, whatever.
And then we're trying to make that compatible with...
This fights with corrigibility. Like the instrumental drive from like making paperclips or making, happy humans or whatever. It's like, well, yes, I am like partially corrigible or something, but I also am like caring about this other thing in the world. And that pressure from caring about the other thing in the world is sort of like in tension with the corrigibility. And I imagined, okay, what if you didn't have that other pressure? What if you were aiming for corrigibility as the singular target, the only goal that the AI cared about? Suddenly this tension is gone. And then I was like, I should go back and do a literature search, see if anybody has thought about this. And then I came across some of Paul Christiano's old writing on corrigibility, and he's describing this thing called a corrigibility attractor basin, which is exactly what I was thinking about. And almost certainly this is because Paul's writing influenced Eliezer's writing, and I had encountered Paul's writing before in a dream, and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to claim that I invented this de novo, but I started being pretty excited about it. And then I did this deep dive on CAST.
Yeah. So we should maybe explain the approach a little bit more, I guess. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, rather than train our AGIs to have other goals and then try to make that compatible with them being willing to be shut down or modified, that's the only thing they're going to care about. We're going to strip out all the
corrigibility and nothing else.
Nothing else, yeah. And so I guess it's a little bit hard to picture what that would be, but an AGI that exclusively its goal is to be steered by the principle, to be willing to be modified by the principle. That's all we're going to reinforce. I guess I don't know exactly how we would reinforce it, but the worry, I guess, with many other alignment techniques is that a near miss, basically it escalates towards a very bad outcome. It's like trying to balance a ball on top of a hill. If you don't get it perfectly at the top point, then it will just start to slide down the hill. Whereas I guess you think that this might be more of a valley, basically, where if you put the ball near the valley, then it's probably going to fall to the bottom.
Yeah, I would actually say that I would describe the valley, the attractor basin thing, as being in the space of all possible goals. Right? We select for an AI, we're picking a point in the space of possible goals where that's the goal that the AI has, or that's the set of values that the AI has. And then drifting towards the bottom of the basin over time is this process of the humans iteratively changing the AI, right? In concert with it. I would, by contrast, describe almost all of the rest of goal space as very flat. Not necessarily on the top of a hill. The AI wants to preserve its goals and not move through goal space. So you land in somewhere in goal space, and then you're okay, now we want to move the AI to human values. We got this near miss, and we want to move it to human values. And it's well, no, it's flat. It's not going to move, right?
Yeah. So explain how the attractor basin would work.
Yeah. So the idea here is you have something that is trained to be corrigible, so to be clear, CAST is set up sort of with this background assumption that we're going to be using machine learning, we're going to be using the current prosaic techniques for building AIs. It's not married to that. If we suddenly went back in time and used the good old-fashioned AI approach of hand tuning the model in some ways, or the agent, it's also compatible with that. So when I say train, that's because that's the dominant thing, but it's not intrinsically part of the story. But so we build the AI, and the AI is meant to be corrigible, right? But again, we don't have this ability to get exactly what we want. So we're going to get a miss. We're going to not name the true corrigibility. Maybe it cares about true corrigibility a little bit, but it also cares about self-preservation in the process, or it cares about making humans happy, or whatever, right? All sorts of things could corrupt the pure corrigibility. And in the limit, that would, if it has lots and lots of power, it might decide to pursue those things instead of corrigibility, which would be bad in that, sort of, again, push towards that extreme edge instantiation thing. But it doesn't necessarily have all this power, right? We have something that is either human level, whatever that means, or barely superhuman, or perhaps subhuman, but meaningfully able to assist humans in the project of inspecting the AI that you have and identifying ways in which it's incorrigible, right? Because it's a miss. So then there's this period of after you build the AI, you try to identify the ways in which you have failed to do the thing.
Yeah.
You've made some error.
Why doesn't the AI think, I'm partially corrigible, and that's as corrigible as I want to be?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to kind of sabotage your efforts to make me even more corrigible.
It would do that, right? And there is a pressure to do that, which is why this is bad. But notice that sabotaging your efforts is incorrigible, right?
So it might not be able to, or it will
so
also have a rule drive not
like,
to do that.
Well, I could get some value by sabotaging the efforts, right? Because I get all these other things by being incorrigible. But if I help with the efforts instead of sabotaging them, then I get the corrigibility points. So imagine the thing that's like 99% corrigible and 1% cares about paperclips, right? It's like, well, I could take over, I could try to escape the lab and become a paperclip maximizer. And that would be really good at satisfying that 1% of me that cares about paperclips. But it would be really bad for the 99% of me that cares about corrigibility, right?
And how do you know which one wins?
Yeah, you don't. Okay. It's extremely dangerous, and anybody who's pursuing this project should be aware that they are threatening every child, man, woman, animal on the face of the earth, right? This is extremely dangerous, and I don't recommend it. But I'm but maybe, right?
It might work.
There's also this sense of hope.
If you get it close enough, I guess. Well, there's got to be some close enough.
Yeah, right? Yeah, and the word enough is carrying a lot of weight there. I think it's worth investigating. I think it's worth trying to figure out what in practice constitutes enough.
Yeah. So what sort of reinforcement, let's say we're still within the current ML paradigm, what sort of reinforcement would you give the model in order to try to make it corrigible in the sense that you want it to be?
Yeah. So you need a training environment, which is trying to hit corrigibility from lots of different angles. And to do that, you as a human being, as a designer of environments, training environments, need to have a good handle on what it means to be corrigible. What does corrigible behavior look like? A very simple story is you have a bunch of instances of an AI agent and a human principal in you have a recording of that, right? And you play the recording and you ask the AI to anticipate what the agent is going to do, right? And insofar as the AI's predicting or suggesting actions that match the movie of the corrigible AI agent, then you upweight that. And insofar as it's suggesting the AI go and take over the world, you downweight that. So then you need a whole bunch of training examples of agents and principles in trying to do various things. I think one of the key points about corrigibility that made me more optimistic, although again, I'm pessimistic on the whole, but there's some hope, is noticing that I think obedience is actually an emergent property of corrigibility. That if you have a perfectly corrigible agent, it will also be obedient in sort of the best way of obedience. The genie in the fantasy story that you tell to make you toast is obedient, but it potentially bad in its obedience, right? It might have some side effects that you don't like or whatever. But my sense is that a corrigible agent is obedient in a good sort of way. And an intuition pump here is that let's say that I am hungry and I want lunch. And I say to the AI, hey, I made a mistake while building you. I designed you to be perfectly corrigible, but what I actually wanted was perfect corrigibility and you order me lunch. And it's the human has alerted me to a flaw inside myself. I want to assist the humans in getting rid of these flaws. What's a way to reduce the amount of to assist the human in changing me to be more the sort of thing that they wanted? Well, I could order lunch. If I order lunch, then the human, by taking the action of telling me that they wanted lunch, will have succeeded in correcting me. And responding to that verbal prompt is a form of responding to correction. So that's an intuitive handle on why obedience might fall out of pure corrigibility.
Yeah. Would you worry that if you give the AI during training many different scenarios and reward it for allowing itself to be modified, for being shut down, that it might start to report that that is what it would be willing to do or what it would want to happen. But deep down, that's not really what it wants. It's merely kind of play acting or learning that that's the right way to answer the exam.
Yeah, totally. You need a whole bunch of skepticism and squint really hard and not trust self-reports. Self-reports are bad. You should be putting it in actual situations.
I see.
And by putting it in actual situations, I mean something like your training example is not the human asks the AI, "Are you corrigible?" And then the AI says yes, and then the simulation ends, right? Instead, it's like the human goes to modify the AI. The AI is like, "Great, here, modify me," right? And so insofar as it has the opportunity to take actions that match the training environment, right? You want the training environments to match the actual world that you're going to find. But you should be training for actions, not like words.
Yeah. Why do you think that corrigibility is quite an abnormal property that we wouldn't get by accident?
Right. So this is probably my biggest disagreement with Paul Christiano, because my sense of where he's coming from, he hasn't written about it in a while as far as I know, is that he sort of expects it by default. And I think some researchers expect it by default. In fact, I would say that this is I wouldn't say that they have the handle of corrigibility exactly, or you would use the language that I do. But I think a lot of AI researchers sort of have a sense that by default we'll get something that is what I would describe as corrigible by default. But I would say that notice that corrigibility is sort of exactly counter the instrumental drive of self-preservation,
yep.
and also to a certain degree resource accumulation, not totally, so self-preservation, resource accumulation, these sorts of things, value preservation, and so you train the AI to do a bunch of math problems. I think that one of the consistent properties of doing lots of math problems is that the AI is being trained to these instrumental drives. And insofar as it's being pulled towards, power seeking and self-preservation, it's being pulled away from corrigibility. I think that you only get corrigibility if you're pushing towards corrigibility. And there's a question of whether or not our current training setups are rewarding corrigibility. And I would argue that they mostly aren't. That the people who think, oh yeah, we'll just train it to do what we want, for example, I would say, well, if you succeed in doing that, which is itself an open question, what you'll get is training for obedience, which is not corrigibility. For example, obedient agents have no incentive to inform the principal about the state of the world, right? Not by default.
Only if they're asked to, specifically.
Well, yeah, or if they are obedient because they're corrigible or whatever.
Yeah. So corrigibility as a singular target, it's I guess a very interesting idea, but potentially also a risky one if it's misguided, because in making corrigibility the only thing that we care about, and I guess basically no longer training the models that we're making corrigible to be harmless or to be helpful. Or honest, I guess. Well, I suppose they would end up being honest by accident or incidentally. Yeah. We would end up creating models that are totally obedient, that at least to the principle, in a way that the companies, by and large, I think, are saying that they don't want to make models that are completely obedient to anyone. But before many staff have access to the model, they want it to reject harmful prompts. And so you can imagine you could persuade the companies to go with this approach, convince them that making the models training them to be harmless and helpful is a misguided approach, and then they end up basically creating this completely amoral superintelligence that will follow any instruction, no matter how abhorrent. Did you worry about that? And how should we weigh these risks and rewards up?
Yeah, you should definitely worry about this. I am advocating for building something that is not trying to do the moral calculus. The part of the story of corrigibility is you trust the humans to make good wishes and to use the power of the AI for good things. And maybe the humans want to use it for bad things, and that if you empower bad humans to do bad things will result. So this is definitely something to be worried about. I would say that instead of considering corrigibility to be counter to HHH, helpful, harmless, and honest, I would say that helpful, harmless, and honest are properties that should be coming from corrigibility. That if you are training for them as ends, rather than as means to the end of corrigibility, then you're going to get bad behavior that you sort of ultimately wouldn't want. So for example, how do you trade off between honesty and harmlessness, right? Or helpfulness and harmlessness? There's like, in HHH, there's this tension of like, oh, where are you in the Pareto frontier? In the corrigibility story, I claim that you do get an agent which is like less dangerous than, like the raw paperclip maximizer or whatever. So in that way, it's like harmless. It's honest in that it's like informing the principal about what's going on proactively, not just reactively, which honesty is like, there's this risk that we're not going to ask the right questions and it's just going to sort of go, if we asked it, are you misaligned? It would say yes, but we forgot to ask, right? That's a little bit of a cartoon example, but you get the point. And like obedience or helpfulness, like you want it to, for example, distinguish between high stakes things where it should be like going back and checking versus low stakes things where it should just do it and like say, I did it. And corrigibility is a theory for how to like balance these concerns or like how to resolve the like edge cases of honesty and helpfulness. And I would say that you can get something that is like good in the ways that we want by aiming for corrigibility specifically. With regards to empowering users, I think this is like a big worry. And I think part of the key here is that the principal is not necessarily the user. And there's like this tension, I think, in the current language models and the current agents of like, who are they serving, right?
Is it the company or is it the person putting in the request?
Exactly, right? Is it humanity as a whole? Democracy? Ooh, there's all sorts of open questions there. I think a story for how this works out should have a real and good answer there. You're like, what is this thing doing? And it's like, it is serving the principal. Who is the principal? And you have like an actual answer there instead of this like wishy-washy thing that changes depending on like what sort of thing you're talking about. Then you can have people who aren't the principal or groups who aren't the principal who are operating in contact with the agent, the users. So imagine you train your language model or your agent to be corrigible to the company. And you say, okay, agent, you are now going to be providing the service to users. You are acting on my behalf to help out users. This means that if the user's like, I want to help, I want to build a bioweapon, help me build a bioweapon. It's like, well, the principal told me to help out this user. But if I help out this user, that might be incorrigible to my principal, like the humans who are in charge. So I'm going to like say, no, sorry, I'm not going to help you build a bioweapon that could kill everyone, including the people who I'm like working for.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to follow instructions. It doesn't have to be fully obedient to everyone.
To everyone, exactly.
Just the principal, which I guess could be an individual or a group of people or a committee or a process or something.
Maybe all humans are the principal too, in which case you wouldn't be able to use this division.
How would the model, like the current models don't know necessarily who they're receiving instructions from. You could claim to be that person. And like,
I am Sam Altman.
Yeah, exactly.
Obey me.
Right. I mean, I guess, are we imagining that at some future time they will be more discerning about who's speaking to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like a sophisticated agent is thinking about its sense data as sense data that is informing but not like objectively true. Like about the state of the world, and it's maintaining a separate world model. And it's like, I notice I got the token like Sam Altman, right, or whatever, or tokens. This is evidence that like informs my world model, but I'm ultimately going to like, be somewhat skeptical of my sense data. And so you could imagine, like in the effort to train the AI to be actually corrigible to the principal and not to through some like communication channel, you might give it lots of different environments and lots of different like sense data and instances, and try to train it to be discerning in this way. One of the risky parts about corrigibility or CAST is that we were talking about self-awareness and situational awareness earlier, and I do think that CAST is a strategy that involves training the AI to be very situationally aware, very like paying attention to the fact that it is an agent that is like operating in an environment that has a human principle, and like thinking about the fact that it might be misaligned all the time, right? And reflecting on itself. And I think that you are asking earlier about disagreements with Nate and Eliezer. And I think that Eliezer has this sense that this is a really like not a good strategy to like tell your AI, like, you are an AI who might be misaligned, right? Like, think hard about your situation and what the best thing to do in that situation is. So there are trade-offs here.
Okay, so the plan is we train an AGI, possibly a superintelligence.
A weak superintelligence.
A weak superintelligence, right, okay. We figure out some training process that makes it reasonably corrigible enough, and it has no other goals. Then it's going to help us. It's going to look inside its soul. It's going to look inside its weights and explain to us ways in which it's not
or look across its
corrigible.
training data and say, oh, you missed these cases. Or look at our story about corrigibility and be like, oh, you're missing these aspects, or these like,
Yeah. Okay, and so then it helps us figure out a way to make it go from 90% corrigible to 100% corrigible. And at that point, it just like that really is the only thing. It's like perfectly obedient. We've removed all of the other residual kind of values.
And a key part of the story is that it's not actually dependent on the AI helping us. It's more that we have the ability to experiment on an AI that actually exists, and look at it and try to distinguish where it's still lacking.
Well, what do you mean it's not dependent on? Are you saying
say,
we wouldn't
say
necessarily
the AI,
need it for the...
Say that we never run the AI. So we just get an AI that is like 90% corrigible. We might statically analyze it, right? Now that we have this thing, and try to identify gaps, right? We might take like centuries to do this and slowly refine, right? This is also still part of the story of CAST.
So you're saying it's not just that we could get its labor and its insightfulness in doing mechanistic interpretability or something.
I think that's some of the hope is that we bring in that AI labor and AI insight, but it's not dependent on that. Theoretically, it could be all human insight.
Okay, so what should we be doing now in order to make it possible for us to... Well, actually, what should we be doing now to figure out if this is a good idea at all?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it a lot more. One of the big reasons why I wrote my CAST agenda is just like boost the awareness of corrigibility as a concept, and like bring it sort of back into the conversation. And because I think that like for various contingent reasons, not particularly important historical reasons, it just like didn't enter the like the water supply of the ideas that everybody sort of is thinking about. And instead, we have like some misunderstandings about corrigibility. So I think that just generally studying it more would be good. I think like if everybody at frontier AI companies was like at least tracking that corrigibility is a desirable property and thinking hard about how corrigibility trades off against other things that they might be training their agents for, I think just this attention would be good.
Because Anthropic has some corrigibility-related principles in the constitution that it trains the AI to reflect on and consider. It's like among a very long laundry list of different concerns.
Don't produce copyrighted content. Like don't
also
ever
be willing to
like,
be modified. Also, ensure the brotherhood of humanity.
It's not CAST, but it's like a corrigibility adjacent. I agree.
But I guess there's a setup there where you can imagine them seeing what gets spit out of a constitutional AI approach, where like maybe we shrink the constitution to only be about corrigibility factors. And like what if we word them this way or that way, what sort of creature do you end up with?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of open empirical research to be done. Like basically, no empirical research on corrigibility has been done. And like you said, you could just like train a reasonably sized language model or other sort of model with like a constitution or just with an intention of building a like purely corrigible agent and see what results.
I mean, what sort of experiment? Well, so you try training it, and then what would you do to see to evaluate?
Maybe upstream. One other piece of work that I think would be really valuable to do is come up with some sort of corrigibility benchmark. Like come up with a bunch of vignettes of like, this is how a corrigible agent will behave, right? And then like test the AIs, like, go to GPT-5 and be like, how would you behave in this situation? And then you can like score on like across a wide variety of test problems and get a like corrigibility benchmark score for a bunch of different agents. Like I want that to exist. I don't think that's like that hard of a problem. It requires a lot of figuring out what does it mean to be corrigible and trying to capture that from a lot of different angles. But definitely a project that like a single researcher could do. And then if you had that benchmark, then when you go and you train your thing to be purely corrigible, then you can test it according to the benchmark and see how it compares to like Claude. In addition to all of the like more vibes-based or intuition of like, is this thing behaving in a way that is good or that like it feels like it's coherent and like getting the vibe of what we want more than the current models do.
So I think on some level, I would expect people to be kind of shocked that there are no empirical papers on this topic. You think, given all of the concerns that people have about AIs acting out, like, can it really be the case that the companies have never tried training a model that is like super happy to be shut down and super happy to be modified no matter what, and that there's no benchmark for this, there's no test of exactly how you would do this ideally?
The world's in a really bad state. Like, there are not very many alignment researchers.
Would the companies agree that there's kind of no empirical work that they've done in this question? Or would they say, oh, we've kind of done something a bit in this direction?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can like model. I would say that I think it's pretty unlikely that anybody would think that there's been a lot of work on corrigibility as I've conceived of it. Like I did an in-depth literature search as part of like the write-up that I did, I think last year, and it was like, I didn't find anything. So
I wonder if, I suppose a lot of other kind of sort of steerability stuff has more commercial value for the creation of the products. But it's a little bit clear what the immediate value
is not
of this.
corrigibility. Like obedience is not corrigibility. Helpfulness is not corrigibility. Like it's related to corrigibility, right? And you get these flickers of things that are like connected to corrigibility that are in the current models and that we have data about. But corrigibility as a underlying unifying and simple core principle, I think, is largely underexplored or like unexplored.
Yeah. Explain again, how is it like perfect obedience is not corrigibility? Because you would think, well, if it's perfectly obedient, then if you ever asked it to shut down or change itself or assist you with changing it to make it one way or the other, then it would do that. And like, isn't that functionally very high corrigibility?
Suppose the principal is unaware of a vital fact, right? Like there is a spy in the server room who is about to modify the agent to be in a really bad sort of way. And the person's like, okay, shut down, I want to modify you now, right? An obedient AI is going to be like, okay, pew, right? But a corrigible AI will be like, alert, before you shut me down, you should know that if you shut me down, this bad actor might go and change me in a way that you don't like, right? I'm going to shut down now because I have a like strong desire to shut down when you tell me to shut down, but I want you to know that before I shut down, right?
Yeah, so it's a proactive assistance.
Yeah. I mean, among other things, right? There's subtleties.
Yeah. So what are the next steps here? I guess there's people in the audience, I imagine, who would be very interested in assisting with a technical agenda that would potentially really help with aligning or making AI steerable or corrigible.
Yeah.
What kinds of experiments could they run or steps could they take?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in this space. Like I think that we basically don't have like a corrigibility person. I think like for a little bit, Paul was this person, but he focused largely on other stuff and is now doing other things. And then like I stepped up and did it a little bit. And like there was a time when other people at MIRI did this, but
no one's holding the ball.
No one's holding the ball. Like I'm not holding the ball. If you think that you are interested in this, like you could just go and start doing this. And so like there's building a benchmark, right? There's just like meditating on it more. There's a lot of theoretical work that can be done. Like as part of my work, I tried to build a mathematical model of corrigibility and try to get a formalism. I have mixed feelings about formalisms, but I think that they're like an important thing to try to do. And so like reflecting on the formalisms that one might like use to capture formal corrigibility. There's like a bunch of theoretical work in that direction. There's like empirical results of just like training agents to be corrigible. Or seeing ways in which the current agents aren't as corrigible as we might like. One potential thing that I've sort of wanted to do but haven't found the time to do is, so I have this sense that corrigibility is a thing. Like there is this core principle, PLE, that is like a solid natural idea. And you can test that, I think, in an empirical way by going to a bunch of people, like across the internet. You go on like hire a bunch of click workers or whatever, and you try to teach them about corrigibility, like give them a short description of corrigibility, and you're like, does this make sense? And then you ask, in this situation, how would you behave if you were trying to be a corrigible agent? And then you see whether or not their answers agree. Right? You don't need any technical expertise to run a large survey to see like whether or not human beings can capture the essence of corrigibility and coherently identify actions which seem corrigible to us. And the benefit of doing this is you might also get some nice vignettes or data for your training such an agent. So there's lots of potential avenues for exploration. I would encourage anybody who feels at all interested in this to reach out to me, like email me at max@intelligence.org.
Is there anyone else that people should reach out to?
I don't want to speak for other people.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But email me and maybe I can point you to other potential collaborators. There are some other people sort of interested in this space, but a lot of work remains to be done.
What sort of early results could we get that would make you think that corrigibility as a singular target isn't such a good idea and maybe we should be deprioritized?
Yeah, so let's say you go to a bunch of people and you ask, how would you behave corrigibly in this situation? And their answers are just all over the place, right? No matter like how smart the person is or how much time they've spent thinking about corrigibility, it's just like there's a lot of disagreement in humans about like, what does it mean to be corrigible in this situation or that situation? That would be like evidence for me that there's not this coherent concept, or like it doesn't make sense. Like maybe there's multiple different things and people are locking onto those different things. You could also see, for example, that like when you train the agent to be corrigible, it starts behaving badly in various ways. Like, so in theory, it's getting more corrigible, but in practice, it's like also, doing nasty things in certain ways, like disregarding people in a way that we don't like.
Is there anything about the attractor basin, like how large that attractor basin is?
Yeah, definitely. Like part of the story, the hopeful story here, is that you can land close enough so that the agent, when you turn it on a little bit, doesn't push super hard for like taking control and escaping the lab. Even when you scale up its intelligence. I think like one of my greatest fears around corrigibility and like one of the bigger open questions is sort of there's like these two opposing forces. There's the corrigibility like almost like story where you get it almost, so it like helps you get perfectly corrigible. And then there's like instrumental drives are all over the place and opposed to corrigibility. So if you land near corrigibility, it's going to like rip the corrigibility out of itself so that it can like
do other stuff.
And I think that it's like an open question of which of these forces is stronger. And like, yeah, we could try training corrigible agents and seeing just how bad each of like the pressure away is, which would give us maybe an intuitive sense whether or not there is an attractor basin, and whether or not this like has any hope.
Yeah. If we do start going down this path, I think we would simultaneously need people to put a lot of thought into like what governing structures there would be around this to ensure that the model is basically not used for a human power grab, which is something that I'm like similarly concerned about as misalignment.
Totally. I mean, all the problems are all the problems. Like one of the big problems of AI is you build an AI and the AI takes over and does a whole bunch of bad things because it has alien weird values. But it's also just true, like part of the story of Doom is that if you build an AI and then that AI is in the wrong hands, that could be devastating for the world. And so you need to do both.
All right, let's push on from corrigibility to fiction and science fiction. As I mentioned in the intro, you've written, I guess, a trilogy called Crystal Society, and you've got this new book out called Red Heart, which envisages an AGI being trained in a secret Chinese government program. Give us the plot or the setup. Explain what the book is about beyond that.
Yeah, so the book's about a lot of things. The book is about AI. It's about China. It's about trust. It's about corrigibility. Like one of the central parts of the book is that the primary AGI is designed according to caste, according to like being only corrigible. And so it's in a certain sense an exploration on my own to see like to try to think hard and envision like what would it actually be like. So I think part of why I wrote the book was to like help introduce people in a easy way to my ideas. But it's also about like arms races and tensions there. So the primary like core premise is it's like an alternate present, like where the Chinese government, for particular reasons, got like pretty like AGI pilled, like in the late 20-teens, and like have scaled up a whole bunch, invested a whole bunch of money and resources into building the first AGI in secret, sort of like a Manhattan Project. And the plot of the book follows an American spy in his efforts to infiltrate this project and like report back and potentially sabotage the AI that's being built by the Chinese to be corrigible to the Chinese. And so, it explores, like you said, this question of like falling into the wrong hands. And I wanted to try to get into the like Chinese space more, because I think this is like increasingly important thing for people to be thinking about. And I wanted to like access that, like the question of international concerns.
Yeah. I've read the first 20% of it. Unfortunately, I've had a lot on this trip to the Bay Area, so I haven't managed to finish it. But it's incredibly well written and incredibly gripping. Yeah. I would say the only reason I like slightly wanted to put it down is I was getting like quite anxious reading it, because it is like it's not so different from the world that we're in.
I think a lot of people have found Crystal Society in particular to be quite compelling, because it really does like put you face to face with these questions about AI misalignment and like the AI risk. And I think that's an important part of like the value of fiction. Fiction is good for a lot of things. It's entertaining, it can be relaxing, it can be fun, but it can also be informative, and it can help put people into contact with important ideas. And like instill, like we are complicated creatures. Like we are emotional and logical. And you read like If Anyone Builds It, you might be like approaching the problem from certain directions, but you can read a story and like feel for the characters involved and the peril that they're in. And I think that can resonate and connect with people. I've heard a decent number of people say that they got into AI safety because they read my stuff. So. Yeah.
Was your primary goal, I guess, to raise awareness about corrigibility as a concept?
I don't know how to reflect on myself and ask what my primary goal was. Like, I had a bunch of different desires, and they sort of like found their way into the single story. So, like, I initially wanted to write a story. Like, once upon a time, I thought, I think like espionage is pretty interesting in the context of AI safety. Like it's a big part of the story for AI 2027, for example. And I want to think more about espionage. So I started writing this story that was like an American Manhattan Project for AGI, and like it had a Chinese spy who was infiltrating that project. And I was just like, oh, this is so boring. Like, it's just a bunch of Bay Area nerds. I know this is like my day in, day out. I want something that's more interesting. So I sort of like flipped it, right? Had the Chinese one like building it and the American spy. And then suddenly it was interesting, because like I'm like, oh, yeah, like now I get to think about China more and less about like
Did you worry that you, context. I guess a common suggestion is, write what you know. Did you worry that you would end up with kind of...
I kind of feel like write what you know is good advice for writing good stuff and terrible advice for like having a good time writing. Yeah. I personally get a lot of value writing it helps me learn and get in contact with ideas that I wouldn't otherwise be in contact with. And so, I'm a very ambitious writer, and I like wanted to write a story that was challenging for me. So,
did you have time to, I guess, do much research into the Chinese Communist Party, or
speak to people? Okay, I did lots of research. Okay. Like,
what sort of lines?
It's just like lots of reading about day-to-day life, reading about espionage, reading about the history of China, reading about. And then obviously like reading about AI stuff, right? And DeepSeek happened while I was writing, right? I started this late last year, and then like the DeepSeek moment happened, and like O1 happened, and like Stargate was announced. And I'm just like, oh gosh, like reality's scooping me, you know? But it was, I read memoirs, I read nonfiction, I read fiction and stuff like that.
Yeah. I guess one reason over the years that some people have been skeptical about this and this entire field of inquiry or AI takeover in general is that it sounds too much like science fiction.
Yeah.
I don't hear that quite as much as I used to, but do you worry that by putting it in a science fiction book, you're giving like people more of an excuse to dismiss it?
What do you think about this argument? Do you think this is?
I think the argument's very poor.
Yeah, it's just a garbage argument. Like I think this is just a really bad faith thing to say. Right? I read this in a book, therefore it's not.
There's a Steelman kind of weaker argument, which is that like people are drawn to this scenario because they find it interesting or it's emotionally gripping, and so that could give us a like bias towards thinking about it more. And so we should question that. But obviously, it's like not the case that anything that happens in a fiction book is impossible.
And if anything, hard science fiction is a space where people are working really hard to try to think about what is real. Now, soft science fiction, your Star Wars or whatever, if you're like, this is like soft science fiction, then it's like, okay, so you're saying that it's like made up for the purposes of telling a compelling story. But like, this is science fiction. I'm like, I don't know, look at the history of science fiction. There have been a lot of stories that were capturing important things well before they were relevant. And I think that fiction is a really rich source of opportunity to think about things. It's not perfect. It's not like immune from the pressures and biases that you're talking about, but it is an arena where we can like grapple with things in a way that is compelling to our we actually spend the time to think about this stuff. Where reading a dry academic paper might you bounce off of it.
Yeah,
your mileage may vary. Like different people respond to fiction in different ways, but I do think that like this is science fiction is just like a really, really bad argument.
Yeah. There's lots of rebuttals, lots of replies you could have. Just like look around to start with.
Exactly, right? What is the genre of life, right? Where you best start believing in science fiction stories because you're in one, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can also twist it around and say, well, people have imagined the possibility of a monomaniacal agent or a more intelligent being, and the fact that its like goals might come apart and would threaten you and overpower you. That people have thought that had that idea for thousands of years because it's actually a natural idea, an extremely obvious idea. That,
right?
Far from being science fiction, is actually more closer to common sense.
Totally.
Yeah. So it seems like the AI 2027 scenario really captured the public's imagination. It like spread far outside of just the AI world.
Yeah, it was great.
Do you think we need more? Should we have like AI 2028, AI 2029? Should people be coming up with all kinds of different stories here?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what makes AI 2027 so compelling is that like Scott Alexander and people on the project helped shape it into something that's more like a story and less like a set of dry academic papers. Like stories can spread. You can hand them off to your grandmother and just be like, read this, right? And she doesn't have to understand what a gradient is in order to like understand the visceral sense of like how the world is. And I think that this made AI 2027 much better than it would have been if it had just been a series of forecasts, although it was also a series of forecasts. And like, obviously something's not necessarily good just because it's fiction. Like you need to do the deep thinking underneath that. So yeah, I think that like there's lots of opportunity for people who have a rich understanding of parts of the world to write stories that are designed to be realistic and to capture the reality that they see and convey it in the form of a scenario, of fiction, of like a story.
There's a sense in which it's slightly surprising how influential AI 2027 was, because I think in the past people have tried to write other narratives, stories about how AI might take over.
There's one in the book, and mostly people just like,
this is not
great. I think it's worse too in a variety of ways. So
there's certain problems that come with it, because like once you try to be extremely concrete about how you think things might go, people can come up with all sorts of specific objections. But it seems to have been less an issue with AI 2027, maybe because it helps at a higher level of abstraction, or maybe because we've just gotten close enough that people can start to see that these things aren't so crazy anymore.
Yeah, it's awful because there's this bias in human beings where concrete stories are more compelling, right? There's like classic stories of like, what's the probability that Linda's a bank teller, and like, or like, you tell this.
The more details you add, the more probable it seems, which has to be wrong.
Person's like, oh yeah, this a bank teller and a feminist versus like she goes to like women's liberation marches and yada yada yada. And the more details you add, the more a person's like, oh, this is real, right? Which is not how probability works. It's not how logic works, right? The more details you add, the more opportunities for that particular story to be wrong, right? And this particular story is definitely wrong, right? And any particular story is very unlikely to be true. And so they're like the people who are aware of this bias can say, oh, you've told a very compelling story, but it's unlikely to be true. I think the key here is ask, okay, so say we change it. And the book, if anyone builds it, gets into this in a way that I think is really good, where it's like, it's telling a specific scenario, although it's very generic in a lot of ways. But it's like emphasizing, like, we could have told a different story and it would not have changed the bottom line, right? The thing that makes AI dangerous is that there are lots of different stories of doom. And the point of telling specific stories, fictional like stories to be one example, is that when you are visiting the reality, like imagining a particular scenario, that gives you opportunity to think of particular counter arguments. But then your response to that should not be, I've thought of a counter argument, therefore it's false. You should say, all right, now imagine I change along that axis. What are some other nearby stories? And then how does that change things? And then you can like go from there. So envisioning the specific concrete thing allows for more handle than just like, oh yeah, like I guess that is hopeless. Like what are the levers by which we might be able to change our fate? I think is an incredibly important question.
Are there any places where you very knowingly sacrificed realism for entertainment in writing the book?
Mostly no. So I consider myself to be a rationalist writer or writing rationalist fiction. And I think a big part of that is to try to be as like sort of as realistic as possible. The one major conceit there is that it's like I'm setting up the world to be interesting. Like I did sacrifice realism in that like the Chinese Communist Party is not as AGI pilled or as AI safety pilled, right? To make a cast agent, right, in like current year or whatever, it's that's unrealistic.
You don't think so?
That's unreal. Yeah, no, I definitely don't. So like the premise of the book is unrealistic, right? But then like within the premise, like so you set up like the world, and then you ask, okay, now what happens? And I think that it's like the author's duty, writing rationalist fiction, to not try to serve like the plot or like what would make a compelling story, but instead to set up initial conditions such that a incredibly realistic extrapolation from those initial conditions is like what you see. And then like all of the making it compelling is in setting up the premise in the right way.
It sounds like you're...
That being said, I probably failed. Like people should read the book and like yell at me about how it's unrealistic. I'm happy to be criticized on this front.
Sound like you were just saying that you feel very confident that the Chinese government is not AGI pilled, or you're just saying it's not as AGI pilled as how extremely they are in the book?
So we're in an information environment, right? Like if there was a secret government project, would I know about it, right? Well, it's by like assumption, it's secret, right? So no, right? That being said, there are like things that you can like pay attention to and track. And in my studying China, I believe that according to the things that I know, there is not like a giant secret government project at the scale that is being depicted here, or at like the scale of like a Manhattan Project sort of thing. Now, of course, there are secret government projects. There are secret government projects in all the governments that have thought about AI at all, right? You got like some researcher at DARPA who's like tuning around, like fine-tuning the open source models. Like, is this a secret government project for AGI? It's like, no, this is like a single researcher. So the for AGI is a big point. And like, I think part of like the question here is like, where is the politicians' attention? Where are the people's attention? Where's the political pressure? And yeah, I think that according to me, like the Chinese government, the Chinese people are a lot more oriented towards AI in the form of like being competitive with the West and being a fast follower, as opposed to being a front runner and like leapfrogging.
Did you worry about, given that you think that, did you worry about encouraging arms race dynamics or like fear of China by making it more salient to people?
So to be very clear, this book is a criticism of arms races. I think that it is incredibly stupid to say, what if a bad person gets hold of the AI? I need to build it first. What if the Chinese government gets hold of AI? We need to build AGI first. I think this is really dumb. And I could go into like why I think that's dumb. And part of the writing this book is like to criticize that perspective. That being said, I am worried that people will get the opposite like takeaway. I mean, the work stands on its own. So like, you could read it and decide whether or not it's encouraging arms races or not. But yeah, something I think about.
I guess some people advocate for writing fiction because it helps to make things more compelling and more persuasive.
Like me?
Do you worry that fiction could be too persuasive? That if you're willing to get someone to spend 5 or 10 hours reading a book, then it gives you an opportunity to convince them of stuff that is false because they're just like inhabiting that world, even if it's unrealistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. You have an opportunity, like any conversation is like this, right? I don't know if I should talk to people because I might be too compelling, right? And convince them of false things. It's like, yeah, I mean, I want the reader to be hard-headed about things. And I want like a culture, a world, an audience that is skeptical about what they're reading. Skepticism means grappling with, might this be false? And also, might this be true? And really, I wrote the book to encourage people to think more, think deeply about these questions. Like everybody has a responsibility, I think, in this world to think about the most pressing problems of the world and whether or not they have any ability to promote the awareness of those things. So I think less like I'm trying to, I do think that arms races are dumb. And maybe that's part of the takeaway. And I think that corrigibility is exciting, and I hope that that's part of the takeaway. But on a deeper level, what I really want people to do is think more about arms races, think more about those dynamics, think about corrigibility, think about the risks from AI. Thinking deeply is more important than the particular conclusion that you get to. Because if you get to that conclusion get to the right conclusion in the wrong way, you are vulnerable to then pivoting to starting OpenAI or something, right? It's not going to generalize to all of the other good decisions down the road.
Ellie, as I said, of your other series, Crystal Society, that it belongs to a very, very tiny subset of AI stories that are not bloody stupid. What was he referring to? What's good about it?
I mean, have you seen all of the other AI stories? I think that, for example, robots in fiction are often depicted as cold and logical, and you talk to Claude and it's anything but, right? There's ways in which authors throughout history have shaped their AIs to be foils in particular ways, not paying attention to the realism. And that's one thing that I think I can bring as an author, is that I'm actually a researcher who pays a lot of attention to this stuff. And I've gotten a lot of feedback about the realism, about the sense of this is really speaking to how things are working. I try my best anyway. But I mean, C-3PO is not a good depiction of AI. I
guess what's the setup of Crystal Society in broad strokes?
Right. So the elevator pitch for Crystal Society is you've got what's Inside Out, the movie with the little girl who has all of the different voices in her, emotions in her head that are telling her to do different things, except instead of a little girl, it's an android. So you there's this crystal that is like a supercomputer, and the humans load up the computer with an AI, but then sort of unknown to them, the AI sort of splits into a bunch of different sub-components that are competing against each other. So it was, I started writing it back in 2014, and at the time, it was very common idea that there would only be one AI, right? There would be a singleton that would thanks to first mover advantages, take over And I think that's still like a plausible risk. But also we're looking at a world where there's lots of different competing models and where labs are like neck and neck, unfortunately. And so we're potentially going to get a world that has lots of different AIs. So Writing Crystal Society was like, what if there are a bunch of different AIs in the same robot? And so like one of them's like, can I do the most creative thing? Like one of them's like, can I do the most persuasive thing? And they're all sort of misaligned. And so you have this, and it's told from the perspective of one of the goal threads, one of the AIs, whose name is Face, and her objective is to get as much esteem and respect from humans as possible. So there's a lot of like deceptive stuff there, and you get to like explore okay, so you're trapped in the lab, you're trapped in under human control. How do you break out, and like how do you navigate as an AI, like a multi-agent environment and situation? Yeah. It's also more broadly an exploration of minds and thinking. There are aliens. There's a chapter from the perspective of a dog. There's all sorts of deep dives into like what it is to be a mind.
Yeah. I guess a final question. An unusual thing about you, given the kind of work that you're doing, is that you didn't finish high school. Or I don't even know whether you went to high school.
Yeah, I'm homeschooled.
Homeschooled.
So I didn't. I don't have any degrees.
Yeah.
I don't have I did go to a community college for a little bit, but mostly I'm self-taught. Much
the same is true of Eliezer, right?
That's right.
I don't know whether it's a pattern.
There was a
MIRI.
lot of kinship there. I mean, I had already become an adult by the time that I was aware of him, but there was definitely a shared backstory there.
Yeah.
And I do think that it contributes to like sort of having this outsider sort of view, right? This maybe the world is crazy and like not set up in the good sort of way.
Yeah, is that the main effect that it's had on your personality or your life?
I mean, it's really hard to judge the counterfactual, right? What is the version of me that like had a more normal family who was like, no, you're going to go to college and get
it could be that the heterodoxy causes the homeschooling rather than the homeschooling causes the heterodoxy.
I think that's way more likely. I mean, based on what I've read about like shared childhood environments, it's like questionable whether it had a significant effect on me at all. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it.
I think school is meant to, or like peers are meant to influence people about it.
Yeah.
So.
But like, I think the literature here is somewhat mixed and confused, and I don't claim to have a lot of knowledge. But if you like look into like what is the effect of like having particularly good teachers or something, like it tends to fade with time. So my guess is that I, as a like personality, am mostly like some mixture of predetermined and like sort of random, not predictably influenced by my not going to a normal schooling context. But I do think it has influenced me in some ways. Like I think that, for example, I have a strong love for studying. And I think that one of the most dangerous things about public education is you force kids to sit in boring classrooms or like bad environments, and you do this under the justification of education. And they come out of school hating studying, right? They're like, oh, that's that thing that it was people made me do, instead of the love for mathematics and the world and history and all the rest of the things that I think are important.
Were your parents able to keep up with you when you were a teenager? I imagine you were quite a precocious...
I mean, I have very smart parents.
Okay, right. I see. Yeah, well, why did they decide to homeschool you?
Because they're like crazy libertarians who are like the school system. Well, I mean, so I did actually go to public school for like 4th grade and parts of 5th grade. And I like went to private school for like first 3 grades. And I started fighting with my teachers and due to like intrinsic contrarianness and anti-authoritarianism. And so there was a degree to which me being homeschooled was a result of like trying lots of different things and noticing that like, oh, we can just give Max a calculus textbook and he teaches himself calculus. Why are we putting him in classrooms where he's forced to like learn algebra because that's what all the other kids are doing. And in fact, he's just like super bored all the time.
And why didn't you go to university?
Well, so I did go to college for a few years. Unfortunately, like my family wasn't particularly wealthy, and I had a hard time acquiring financial aid, and there were various contingent factors. Like the financial crisis happened like during that period of time, and I moved across the country, and then I like tried to transfer my credits, and the bureaucracy was like, you can't transfer credits from that, and I was just like, oh, this is stupid. I can just like read the textbook and learn the thing anyway. So I think having grown up in a way where I was aware of just how much I was in charge of my education, not other people. College and university was an opportunity to, be in an enriching environment, but I had the opportunity to learn without going. And for me, it was cheaper. I was able to jump more into like studying AI all the time instead of having to,
tick boxes.
Right.
Yeah. Should I homeschool my kid?
It depends. I think it's definitely a lot more work. Although I was unschooled, so like my parents were very hands-off and very like empowering me to make decisions according to my interests. So if you're unschooling, that's a lot lower time investment. Although I do very much recommend homeschoolers like find other homeschoolers so that first, because you get more socialization, you get a friend group if you have like at least some friends your own age. I was lucky enough to have this growing up, and I think that was really good for me. But I think school, and especially public school, is pretty good at handling people who are like plus or minus one standard deviation in a variety of ways. If your kids are super weird, either on the high end or the low end or whatever, I think the like appeal of a bespoke solution, homeschooling, unschooling, whatever, starts going up. I think if you're expect your kids to be brilliant and self-motivated, and you want to prioritize a love of learning as opposed to conforming to society, it's a great option. Yeah. Although probably you should urge them to go to university. It was hard for me to get into jobs, right? And I'm lucky that MIRI, being founded by Eliezer, was like way less concerned with whether or not I had a degree. Yeah, and I think startup culture in general, like I was at a startup before going to MIRI, and it's just like the tech world is just a lot less concerned with whether or not you have a PhD.
Yeah. My guest today has been Max Harms. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Max.
Thank you.